Take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the special meeting of council. I'll call the meeting to order, a special meeting of council for Wednesday, May 27th. Look to the agenda. Are there any additions or changes?
None from administration.
In case, I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Councilor McCallum, you may want to turn your mic off for this part. Thank you. We'll just skip right to H1, the new business. This is the purpose of the meeting, and we'll dive right into the COVID-19 financial response. As Ms. Richardson, Darren.
I'm going to start us off.
Okay, Ms. DeSoto.
Yes, thank you. I believe Therese Rogers will be sharing the presentation, so I'll allow her to share her screen. Quite a bit of work has been undertaken since the Finance Committee met in late April and gave us some direction. And so we have a bit of a lengthy presentation today, and council may wish to ask questions during the presentation. I think that's appropriate so that we're not skipping over big chunks of information that you would like to discuss. So please feel free to ask your questions as we go through. There will be three of us presenting today: myself, Therese Rogers, General Manager of Corporate Services, and Chelsea Richardson, Manager of Finance. And this presentation actually sets the stage for the two following presentations, which Council or the Finance Committee gave us direction to bring back programs to help support those businesses and residents most impacted by the pandemic. And those programs are alluded to in this presentation, but will not be presented in detail until the following presentations. So, just by introduction and context, I'll ask Therese to advance the next slide. Sometimes there's a delay. There we go. As we're all discovering now, and I think Council's quite familiar, as well as our community, that the COVID-19 pandemic is a marathon, not a sprint. There are many, many more unknowns than there are knowns for our future. And so we face a future that is quite uncertain. And despite that uncertainty, we can certainly foresee in administration and in our community, in our business community, we can foresee a future when tourists do come back and when we're the bustling community that we once were again, and that people are on our main streets and shopping and dining and recreating freely, and certainly, hopefully, we'll be able to greet each other with handshakes and hugs in the not too distant future. However, that future, when it will arrive, is what's uncertain, and we know we are already lean. So in preparing for that future, we just want to set the context that deep cuts now will have long-term impacts for our ability to be ready to respond to these changing circumstances and to continue to maintain our service levels. That's okay, Therese, you can move to the next slide. So as a reminder, the motion from the April Finance Committee is on the screen there. And through this presentation, we will walk you through how administration has addressed each of the outcomes you asked us to achieve in bringing you back budget amendments. So just as a reminder, those outcomes were to maintain essential services and business continuity, provide for reductions to expenses to offset our revenue loss, allow for the scalability of our operations, to provide for those social and economic development supports that I was discussing earlier, and to provide options to reduce the year-over-year tax requirement to 0%. So just a reminder, within that motion, it referred to a medium impact scenario. Administration needed to choose a point in time to do this work too. And back in April, when we were presenting to the Finance Committee, we had recommended that point in time of being midsummer, the end of July. So with that scenario, the expectation was that by August, Elevation Place and the Recreation Center would be reopening and revenues would start to return. We might be able to have some summer events and festivals later in the summer, and certainly tourism activities would rebound. We now know that this is highly unlikely. That's probably a very optimistic start time given some of our understandings. So as you'll see in our recommendations, we are proposing that we maintain sufficient contingency to be able to address the unknown. So what do we know? Well, we know that the province has issued a 3-stage plan for reopening. We also know that we're in the midst of a national-wide global economic crisis as a result of the pandemic. But the stage 1 opening started May 14th, and we're in it. Some businesses and medical services have started to reopen. And the province has said they will take a wait and see approach to announcing a start time for stage 2. It depends on how the health outcomes are impacted by the reopening of stage 1. So stage 2 is to be determined. The Premier did say verbally that it would unlikely be before June 19th. However, we know that within stage 2, recreation centers, pools, events, festivals, arenas, all still remain closed. Stage 3 would be sometime beyond that stage 2. And again, it would depend on the health outcomes of stage 2. And in stage 3, most restrictions would be lifted, but under the provincial guidelines, the requirement for physical distancing still remains. So what we don't understand and what hasn't been provided by the public health professionals is how we will be able to operate or what those guidelines will look like for opening our facilities with physical distancing. Some of you may have looked at some of the guidelines that have already been prepared and proposed by the province for the businesses, for restaurants, et cetera, with 50% capacity. Those are some of the likely scenarios that will be required for recreation center openings. So again, we don't know when stage 2 or 3 will commence, when our facilities will open, or how long our service will be impacted. And that service impact has a significant impact on our revenues. And also what we're seeing is we have significant increases to our costs as a result of responding to the pandemic. And we know that as we start to reopen our facilities, we'll have even more costs to modify our operations, to impose new cleaning protocols, et cetera. So you'll hear about those in the coming slides. And the timing of a second wave is also something that is uncertain, but we know is likely and have to plan for. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Chelsea Richardson, who will take us through some of what we understand our financial risks are.
Just before before we move on, Mrs. DeSoto, will there be a discussion point in the presentation around anticipated tax, the possibility of not collecting all of the tax levy and how the town might be prepared to handle that eventuality?
I believe that's this slide right now.
Okay.
Your timing is perfect.
Great, thank you.
So in addition to all the unknowns that Ms. DeSoto was just speaking to, we've also identified a number of key financial risks that have accompanying assumptions and proposed mitigations. And the first relates to cash flow and our ability to continue to meet payroll and make significant capital expenditures with those delays in the collection of tax and utility payments. We believe that sufficient cash and investment balances exist. However, there will be less of a buffer than we would normally have for any future unforeseen events. The next touches on what you were just addressing, Mayor Borrowman, and that it primarily relates to the cash flow. So it's related to the first point again. and that likely due to the increased economic hardship for a lot of property owners in our community, there is a higher proportion that could go into arrears. So we believe this is mainly a short-term impact to the cash flow, that we won't receive the payments potentially in the timeframes that we normally do, but we believe those amounts ultimately will remain recoverable. They just might be recovered over a longer period of time than we typically experience. The next item relates to, you may recall in our initial budget for this year, our intent was to use paid parking revenues to offset the costs of the fare-free transit. Now that those revenues will not be coming in this summer, but there are still the costs related to transit, we've been analyzing our options in that area. The BVRTC has indicated that their operating reserves are available and there for shortfalls in revenues versus expenses, and that it won't have to come back to council. For grants, again, this ties back primarily to cash flow, and there's been some communication that the timing around the receipt of the monies might be different than in typical years, but we still expect to receive the full amounts we were expecting this year. And finally, as we'd spoken to in the previous slide, while we received direction to proceed based on that medium impact scenario, the end of July, we now believe it is highly unlikely that that will actually be the case, that the impacts will continue longer. So that would mean further revenue losses that may only potentially be partially offset with the savings from the closures and the layoffs that have occurred. So this is why, as you'll see later in our recommendations, we don't recommend fully draining the tax stabilization reserve to save some buffer against that duration uncertainty. And next, I'll hand it off to Ms. Rogers to go through some of the items from the motion from the last Finance Committee meeting.
Thank you. So I will walk you through now our actions on those 5 motions that Council has made, actions and recommendations. So again, the first motion of the Finance Committee was to maintain essential services and business continuity, and a number of steps have been taken to address this. We've established the Emergency Coordination Center to help guide our actions. We have set up emergency social services to support our community social service needs through a call center and also an email response that continues to get activity. We have redeployed staff to communications, human resources, and economic development to support those areas and the increased workloads that they're actually seeing as a result of the COVID. We've advanced maintenance activities for recreation facilities, so taking advantage of having those facilities closed to do annual maintenance work, and really helping us not have to close those facilities again once we can reopen. We have increased cleaning of all of our facilities, and we've modified work protocols to have different shift start times and different work locations so that we can maintain physical distancing in facilities where staff are still working. Our IT team has helped us get over 90 employees working from home who continue to serve the community with their regular work. Communication to residents and employees has been enhanced up until now, providing daily updates, and now probably every other day. And while we maintain essential services, we have also started the return to work planning process, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. Okay. The second item that the Finance Committee had directed us to was to provide departmental expenditure reductions to help mitigate these losses in revenues that we've seen as a result of facility closures primarily. And so I'll just walk you through this spreadsheet here quickly, and I'll get my laser pointer if that helps. The bulk of our lost revenue to date occurs from the closure of Elevation Place and the Canmore Recreation Center. And again, this scenario that we have here was the midterm assumption through the end of July. So this chart does not take into consideration what lost revenues would occur if these facility closures extend beyond the end of July. But we were just meeting the motion per council based on that recommendation. So the bulk again of those lost revenues occur in recreation sales and rentals due to the closure of Elevation Place and the Rec Center. We have seen a reduction in fines. So we're seeing revenue loss in photo radar and also fine loss from tax and utility deferrals. It's about $65,000 typically at this time of year that we would have received from penalties that come with the late payment of taxes and utilities. Now we've extended a deferral program and waived any penalties, but there is an impact to that. Obviously the right thing to do, but it does come at a cost. And then we have some general penalties or sales that occur throughout the organization in other areas that round out that $2.7 million. Managers and supervisors have worked very hard over the past few weeks to find savings in the operating and capital budget. We'll talk about capital more in a few minutes. And this exercise was extremely challenging and comes with service level impacts. As identified in the recent organizational review and Ms. DeSoto spoke to in her opening, we are a very lean organization already, and cuts like this have an impact and are not sustainable over the long term. Contracted services, supplies, and general purchases were reviewed in the context of our changing services and service levels, and we adjusted budgets accordingly. We've eliminated spending in travel, hosting, conferences for professional development. And more detail on these expenditure savings is available in the agenda package in attachments 1 and 2. Okay, again, we also know that the medium-term scenario to the end of July is not realistic. And when we first brought this option to you on April 21st, it seemed possible. But it has now become clear that although we don't know when we will be able to reopen our facilities, it won't be July, and it's likely to be much later in the year. So the revenue losses we have seen to date will continue, and it will become increasingly difficult to offset lost revenues, as many expenses that you see here have been cut for the balance of the year. These savings include costs related to service levels and general expenses that may not materialize as anticipated. So we're still coming to terms with what reopening looks like and what those costs will be, and I'll talk again a bit more about that in a moment. So I do want to talk about service level impacts next, as the bulk of the savings come from salaries, wages, and benefits, but I will stop for questions. Go ahead, Mayor Borman.
Yeah, thanks. So the chart, the revenue loss, that's to date, or is that anticipated for?
That is anticipated through the end of July.
End of July.
Yeah.
And as we know, it's not likely to end in July, so there'll be substantial revenue loss in the second half of the year as well.
Correct. And there will be some savings. Again, the bulk of our savings have come from the salaries, wages, and benefits line. If facilities remain closed, those staff remain laid off. And so we will have some of those savings, but it is unlikely that we will be able to offset all of the revenue loss with expense savings, which is where Ms. Richardson had started to suggest that we need to keep some of our tax stabilization reserve for those unknowns that we can't predict but expect will happen.
Right, thank you.
Right.
Any other questions at this time? See none, that's great. Can you proceed?
Thanks. I will. So to date, we've laid off 126 employees. We've suspended seasonal hiring, and we haven't filled vacant positions. And this is significant and has a direct impact on service levels. All recreation programs, including summer camps and childminding, have been canceled. Community and event program grants have been canceled, with those funds being redirected to support those most in need. Community events have been canceled, with only New Year's Eve still tentatively scheduled. Our parks have seen significant reductions in service levels, including the elimination of the downtown flower barrel program, reduced mowing of parks and sports fields, and washroom closures in parks. The new driver rebate program and the law enforcement bursary have been canceled to respond to the reduction in photo radar revenue. The only education and training that will occur for the balance of the year for staff is where it's legislated for staff or public health and safety, or where required to maintain professional designations. All employee events have also been eliminated. These cuts have impact to the public, and they have impact to staff, many of whom are working harder than ever to support our community. The third motion of the Finance Committee on April 21st was to allow for scalability of operations post-pandemic. It's an interesting situation to be in, that while we're still figuring out closures and how to offset those expenses, we're also having to turn our minds to what reopening might look like. And the world isn't returning to how things were, at least not for a very long time. And so we really are trying to figure out what that new normal looks like in this new pandemic world. As I spoke to earlier, we don't know when we will be able to reopen our facilities, but it won't be July and probably will be later in the year. So the revenue losses that we've seen to date will continue and become more difficult to offset. So we may need to find a new way to provide financial support for a longer and undefined period of time. In addition to the unknowns with lost revenue, we are facing some significant and uncontrollable cost increases in the longer term budget. The next federal census is scheduled for the spring of 2021, and we are expecting it to identify that our population has reached 15,000. Once that happens, our RCMP contract costs will see an increase of approximately $600,000. This level of population growth also triggers the need to begin increasing staffing levels in the fire department to maintain appropriate emergency response. In the more short term, early opening guidelines from the province and across the country include requirements for more frequent cleaning and for personal protective equipment for employees that wasn't previously required and comes at a cost. We're currently estimating the need to fund COVID-related expenses with about $300,000, but as we learn more about that from the province and what reopening requirements look like, that number could rise significantly. An example of this is day camps, which to now have been canceled. The province has indicated that they may open, but the restrictions and requirements for cleaning and the caps on numbers of campers may make running day camps not a viable option for us. So at this point, we are anticipating that $300,000 in additional COVID-related expenses, but depending on the service level decisions that are made, we may need to come back and ask council for more funding about that. And that would include things like parks washrooms. Those washrooms are currently closed. If they need to be opened, they have a cost that is currently not in the budget or not completely funded in the budget.
Will you be talking to that a bit later in the presentation, or I'm just curious if we have a cost established for that work?
I will ask Ms. Smithers to answer that question. She has done some work with her team on that.
Thank you.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, so I think as Ms. Rogers indicated, the two issues that we're looking at with the public washroom maintenance are one, layoff of facility staff who would clean the service washrooms and not bringing on the full complement of seasonal staff that would be cleaning the park vault toilets. So not only are we looking at reduced resources to deliver that cleaning now, there's actually a premium on that I've been calling the COVID premium to clean to the standard that we would need to during the pandemic. So the cost associated with opening all of the washrooms and cleaning them to this new standard would be about an additional $170,000 to the end of the term in 2020.
170,000 for the duration of the year.
Yeah, so to open the remaining washrooms that are currently closed would be about an additional 34,000 in typical, in the typical situation. But then when we add on the additional cost for PPE, increased cleaning. So for example, the parks, the vault toilets, usually they're only cleaned about 2 or 3 times a week. In this new situation, we have to clean them daily, right? And then there's for the service washrooms, we're cleaning them deep cleaning at night, and then 4 times a day we're going in and doing increased sanitization. And that's on the recommendation of the health inspector in conversations with the facilities team. So that additional kind of COVID premium across all of the service washrooms and the vault toilets is about $140,000.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Yeah.
Mayor Borman, could I just add a point of clarification at this time as well? Ms. Cottle sent me a message to point out that while we have canceled all events and certainly the Canada Day parade and Canada Day festivities in the park have been canceled, she wanted me to point out that their arts and events team is working hard to provide some innovative ideas and programming for a Canada Day celebration that would not be the parade. So we are looking at ways to celebrate Canada Day during this pandemic.
Excellent, and I'm certain that they'll come up with some brilliant suggestions.
Okay, sorry, Ms. Rogers, you can continue.
The next item of discussion is council's direction to provide increased social and economic development supports for those individuals and businesses most impacted by the pandemic. Recognizing that changes to property tax impact property owners and have a consistent impact really across the board, council directed administration to develop more targeted programs to provide increased social and economic supports for those who have been most impacted by this pandemic. And later in today's meeting, you will hear details about both of these programs, which are currently proposing just over $500,000 in funding. The final direction of council was for administration to provide options to reduce the municipal 2020 tax requirements to the 2019 level. And before we get into the options and the recommendations that administration has for council, I just wanted to summarize where we're at. So we had, again, through the end of July, predicted this $2.7 million in lost revenue. Through expense reductions and service level reductions, we have achieved, again, a balanced budget and offset those lost expenses. And then we have some new programs and costs that we need to fund. The social program supports, which Lisa Brown will speak to later, are requesting about $245,000 funding. The business supports that Eleanor McClett will walk you through are about $281,000. Our estimates so far for this COVID premium, as Ms. Smithers called it, or this additional cost that we had not anticipated or budgeted for because of COVID, are currently at $300,000. And then to eliminate the that tax reduction and bring us back to that 2019 tax level is $1.2 million. So we are still looking to fund just over an additional $2 million in addition to the $2.7 million in lost revenue that we have offset. So I'm just going to turn it back over to Ms. DeSoto to walk through a couple of options that we are not recommending, and then I'll join you again to walk through capital.
Just before you move away from this slide, so to be clear, the social program supports, business program supports, and 2020 COVID spending, all of those are expected to be funded from the tax stabilization reserve.
That is what we're recommending, yes.
Right. So it leaves the 1.2 million for council to find ways of reducing the budget by 1.2 to meet the original target of no increase in the tax requirement from 2019.
That's correct. And we have some recommendations or suggestions to walk you through.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Ms. DeSoto.
Yes, thank you. So the first option we considered when looking at finding additional savings to offset that $1.2 million was to consider some salary rollbacks or further reducing the hours of work that employees are scheduled for and thereby reducing their salaries. And that would have come with a service level reduction. So there are a number of considerations I want to walk through, and our recommendation, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, is to not do any of these further reductions. And the reason for that recommendation is because of a number of important considerations. The first being legal. We did consult with our legal counsel on our obligations as an employer and our rights as an employer. And what we were advised is that whenever you change the terms of an employment agreement, there are significant challenges. And it's very difficult to do this unilaterally across the employment body so that it's fair. And that is one thing that we had been looking at, for example, reducing 20% hours, going to a 4-day work week and shutting our offices for 1 day a week. But there are unique differences in our employment agreements with salaried employees, which are our managers, supervisors, and the executive levels, myself and the general managers, versus our hourly employees, and again with our union employees where we have union agreements. So the terms of each of these agreements need to be negotiated with the employment group. So essentially with salaried employees, we would need to seek voluntary compliance to reduce salaries. And while we can schedule hourly reductions for hourly employees, we can't do that unilaterally for unionized employees. We have to negotiate that with the union. And any of these types of actions could be considered constructive dismissal and could be challenged by employees. So that's one consideration, but even a larger consideration in my mind is the impacts on our relationship with our employees and the culture that we thrive to maintain at the town of Canmore. In Canmore, people, our citizens and our employees are our greatest asset. We believe that. We want to treat our employees with respect and with fairness. And there are many, many studies that show that the repercussions of these types of actions often result in lower commitment, lower engagement, and just productivity amongst the employment. As Ms. Rogers has already pointed out, we've significantly curtailed our number of staff already due to the closure of our facilities. So those staff where we no longer had work for within our recreation and facilities department have been laid off. That represents 126 staff. We have also put a hold on all vacant position filling, as well as bringing in new employees and seasonal employees. So we've already cut where we think we can cut. And the remaining departments are very much providing business as usual, whether they're doing that from home or whether there are in our operations teams providing essential services like solid waste programs, fire, RCMP, and streets and roads, etc. So, and many of our employees have seen increased workload due to the COVID health pandemic. So for all of those reasons, it doesn't make sense to reduce our hours and service levels when we're providing the level of service that the public and the community has come to expect and needs. So our recommendation is that we do not further reduce salaries through rollbacks or reduced hours. And I'm not sure if there are any questions at this point.
I don't have a question. I have an observation, but I'll throw the floor open for questions. But the observation is the first part of the motion that Finance Committee approved back in April was that we maintain essential services and business continuity. And it's become clear to me through many discussions that given the depth of staff reduction to this point, further reductions would certainly cut into essential services and business continuity. And while I know that the residents of the town are looking to council to address this situation in a fiscally prudent way, I also know that residents do have a certain expectation for service delivery. So I think that administration has found that balance and you've expressed it quite clearly in this report. Are there questions from members of council? Seeing none, go ahead.
Okay, so the other option we considered, and I think we talked about at the Finance Committee, was to look to our partners and affiliates to see if there was potential savings from their budgets. There are a number of considerations in this area as well. Specifically, our affiliate requisitions have already been issued. So at the beginning of the year in Q1, we remit the revenue necessary to all of those partners. So if we were to scale back from them, they would have to cut us a check, so to speak, and send us some funds back. And those funds are small. Even if we scaled the affiliate partners back to 2019 levels, it would result in a $69,000 savings. So when we're looking for $2 million, it was really just a drop in the bucket. And if you look at some of our larger partners, CCHC, the library, the museum, and Arts Place, they've all had significant impact to their operations and have been managing, much like we have at the town of Canmore, to address lost grants, lost revenues, layoffs, innovative ways to deliver programming, etc. So our recommendation is that we maintain the 2020 funding commitment to our affiliate partners and not seek that as a method of cost savings.
Just an observation at this point, in the overhead and discussions there, you haven't mentioned the Biosphere Institute of the Bow Valley, which are not an affiliate in the same sense as Museum and Arts Place, but certainly the Biosphere depends on the annual funding from the town of Canmore to survive. And sitting on the board, I can assure council that there's it's a very lean operation, the Institute, and any sort of reduction of funding from the town of Canmore would have really major significant impact. So that's just an observation for council's information.
Okay, and now I will hand it over to Ms. Richardson.
So if those are not options that we recommend, we have to look to other funding options available. And first, as we've discussed at other meetings, and as you had alluded to earlier, Mayor Borman, we do have the tax stabilization reserve. So there are a number of considerations. Going back to our earlier comments, we believe there is a high likelihood of the pandemic extending beyond the July scenario and potentially even into 2021 and beyond, particularly if there is a second wave. Then we have the unknown COVID-related costs, and we don't know what our revenue levels will look like post-pandemic. Additionally, the last several years, we had been intentionally building up our tax stabilization reserve to address some of the items Ms. Rogers had spoke to that are coming in 2022 and 2023 related to the RCMP and the fire department. And now, as we know, 2020 is looking to be a very tight year. We are unlikely to have a surplus for this year, which is typically what we use to fund the tax stabilization reserve, as we generally have a small surplus each year. So our recommendation is that we fund our COVID-related programs from the reserve, but maintain that remaining balance within the reserve to address all those unknown items. So as you can see in the table, we have the opening balance with the 2019 surplus allocation that we had done is now $4 million. And if we fund the social supports, the business supports, and our incremental COVID costs, we've put in that placeholder of $300,000, we will still have $3 million in the reserve balance for us to have to address both the unknowns that we have related to the COVID pandemic, but also those future known costs we have around the RCMP and the fire costs. And with that, I'll pass it off to Ms. Rogers to talk about the remaining items and how we actually address reducing taxes.
I'm just going to interrupt again with another mayoral observation. Just thinking about the tax stabilization reserve, which if I recall was first created by council around 2008 or so. I don't know if anybody has a better memory of that, but the council of the day created the tax stabilization reserve really for exactly this circumstance, though we had no idea this was going to happen. But it was created to give the town a cushion that we could address unforeseen circumstances in ways as we are this year. And honestly, in the intervening years, councils have been very, very careful not to access that reserve without real need. So I just want to throw a compliment back to the council of the day for their foresight in creating this reserve.
Okay, so in order to preserve the balance in that tax stabilization reserve for these continuing unknown expenses, managers reviewed capital projects in detail, and I'll walk you through what administration recommends as far as projects that we felt could have scope reductions, funding reductions, or be canceled with the least long-term impact. These changes will allow us a corresponding reduction in transfer to reserves, which shows up as an expense item in the budget. We determined that we would continue with the project if it was grant funded, if we saw lower impacts due to lower traffic volumes, like the very important water and sewer utility work that's happening at Railway Avenue and Benchlands Trail. And we're also proceeding with projects where significant work has already taken place and funds are already committed and would be lost if we canceled or changed scope. If the work is required to meet regulations or safety considerations, those projects are also going ahead. Attachment 3 in the agenda package included the capital options and the details sheets that help explain the scope of work of the projects we are going to talk about next. We have prioritized these projects for your consideration to try to minimize long-term impacts. These projects are all important and they were achieved because, or pardon me, approved because they are a key part of achieving council's priorities for the community. And we're really suggesting not never, we're just saying not now, given the timing and what's happening with COVID. These are the projects we're suggesting could be changed with the least amount of impact. What's important to note is that any reductions to transfers and reserves in 2020 need to be made up in 2021 and will have an impact on next year's tax rate. And Ms. Richardson will speak to that a bit more later. The next 2 slides will outline administration's recommendations and provide some options for council's consideration should you wish to explore them. So this first slide of funding options is administration's recommendations. And again, if council wishes to achieve that 1.2 million that is required to completely eliminate the 4.8% tax increase, we'll go through some additional options that you could choose from. And our general managers of municipal infrastructure and municipal services are here to help answer questions that you might have about these projects. Again, we've carefully considered each of these projects and feel that either enough work has been done for now, as with the Railway Avenue rehab and the affordable land and housing, or the pandemic has impacted the timing and feasibility of implementation, like with the Town Center Enhancement Plan, the LUB update, and the Visitor Econ Review, or we have found a different solution to get us through the next few years with the light fleet replacement. And that's why those recommendations have come forward from managers to council. If council wishes to trim that full 1.2 million, these are some options for your consideration, and it would be up to council to discuss and debate them later after the presentation is complete. We can certainly answer questions, but that debate would happen after we're done with our presentation here. Again, the work that these projects represent is integral to advancing council's priorities, and we're certainly not recommending removing them all. Doing so would have significant community impact for years to come. I'll stop there and answer questions. Yeah.
Great, perfect. Just to be clear then, the first chart that was on the overhead, the
Yes.
6 recommended projects, that would take us very close to our target of a 0% increase in tax requirement from 2019, which was 1.2 is the target if council continues to feel that's the target.
Yes.
So we would then, we could consider another $100,000 additional reduction in order to get to the target. All of the other projects that are listed on the second chart or the second half of that chart are other projects that council could consider reducing if we wanted to further reduce the tax requirement below the 2019 requirement. Correct?
Correct. Again, just understanding the impact of removing all of these projects on the long-term picture. Yeah.
Right, and we won't get into any debate at this point, but there may be a number of questions from councillors about the specific projects, and is this the time where you would see those questions being best presented?
Yes, we could answer those questions now, or we could finish the presentation, which might be a better approach. Let's finish the presentation and then we
Okay.
can come back to, because this could go on for, there
Yeah.
might be a number of questions. Yeah.
Okay, we'll hold off on questions for now.
Yeah, and I'll turn it back over to Ms. Richardson at this point.
Keep forgetting I'm muted. So first, some additional context. We've done some work with the preliminary mill rates to actually identify what that difference represents for some example properties here in Canmore, both at that 4.8% tax increase and what that could look like if we held to the 2019 levels at a 0% tax increase. So, you know, for many properties, changes to our tax requirement overall will not result in a material change to their 2020 taxes. So again, this analysis, I'll just caveat it by saying it's based on preliminary mill rate calculation, so they may still change slightly between now and when I bring forward the final property tax bylaw. So the first example I'll go through is a residential property, and this is the median residential property. Historically, we've talked about averages, but the median is the exact midpoint. So half of all properties in Canmore are worth more than this and half are worth less. So for this sample property assessed at $730,000 this year, and just as a reminder, as legislated by the province, that assessed value that's shown on current year notices is based on economic conditions from July 1st of the previous year. So in this case, 2019, and not current market conditions. So in this scenario, at the 4.8% tax increase, this median residential property valued at $730,000 would see a $67 increase year over year over what they paid in 2019. If we look at the 0% tax increase in the lower part of the table there would actually be $10 in savings year over year from what they paid in 2019. And that's just due to some of the mechanics of how it works with the change in assessed value of this property versus all the other properties, and also how real growth played out against our budgeted growth. So then on the non-residential side, the median value starts to be a more difficult reference point because of the large breadth of different property types and values here within Canmore. So we chose two examples, and these are real properties within Canmore, one being a hotel on Bow Valley Trail and one being a business on Main Street. And so the first one I'll go through is this hotel. So assessments for the hospitality sector have gone up significantly this year, and we'll see a larger tax increase. We are confident in the current assessed values as they're based on income data that was provided by property owners to our assessor. So for this property, which again is a real property in Canmore, at that 4.8% tax increase, there would be an increase of $16,000 over the 2019 level. But even at a 0% tax increase, there would still be an increase of $13,000, again, because the assessed value has gone up so significantly. Conversely, for the property on Main Street, because its assessed value has changed by a smaller percentage than the assessment growth in the non-residential sector as a whole, for this property, even at a 4.8% tax increase, they would have $24 less that they would be paying in 2020 versus 2019. And then if we're to reduce our overall collection to the 2019 level at that 0% tax increase, that goes up to $342. So as illustrated by these examples, the change in assessed value year over year has a much more significant impact on taxes owing for any given property than changes in the overall collection. Those changes in the overall collection will not necessarily have a direct corresponding change in the taxes owing for most properties. And so these last few slides and these mill rates have really identified what the impacts this year would be. And as Ms. Rogers had alluded to earlier, there's also future impacts to these reductions that we make in the current year. So the mechanics of how we're doing it by reducing our capital program and the corresponding reductions in transfers to our capital reserves from our operating budget, it really shows up like a reduction in our expenses this year. So any reductions in the current year taxes will make for higher increases in the future to return to those same levels. So going into next, we're still talking about 2020, but soon we'll be going into the 2021 budget. And that plan that we have currently now represents a 10% increase if we're returning to the 2019 levels. That'll be a tough pill to swallow next year, and that's before any other adjustments for any other potential impacts of the COVID pandemic or any other increases year over year. So coming to the end here, so this table provides a summary of our recommendations. So as we've talked about, we have 2.7 million in lost revenue, and we found and are recommending equivalent reductions in operating expenditures to offset that. Then we have a number of new programs, the social supports, business supports, and the COVID-related expenses. So we're recommending those come out of the tax stabilization reserve. And lastly, if council wants to achieve a 0% tax increase or some other amount less than the current approved 4.8%, we recommend looking at the capital plan and reducing the capital plan and reserve contributions in the operating budget. All told, these impacts add up to almost $5 million, which is a significant impact to our annual budget. And then I'll conclude with just a few next steps. So today is kind of the first public presentation of these budget and tax impacts. And we're hoping to proceed with some of those approvals today. And then following this agenda item, there's more detail on the support programs from Ms. Brown and Ms. McLeod about the social and economic areas. The plan would be to come back at the special council meeting on June 9th, and anything we don't finalize today could come back at that meeting as well. And at that point, the intent would be to formally bring forward the property tax and supplementary tax bylaws, as well as the tax penalty bylaw, which we'll need to change this year. Then our intent would be to mail tax notices sometime in late June or early July. We can speak to this more when I bring the tax penalty bylaw back, but at this point, our proposed tax payment deadline would be September 30th, and we'd be looking to apply penalties October and December. So those timeframes are different than they would typically be in a year. And part of the reason for that is the commitments that the province has made around deferring the non-residential education piece. And we're planning to match that deferral. And that concludes the formal part of the presentation. And if there's any remaining questions, we can address those at this time.
I have a few just from your presentation just now. So on this slide that's on the overhead, if council isn't able or doesn't get to making final decisions today, then the June 9th meeting would be available for final considerations.
Correct. The more we can get done today, the better we'll be equipped to bring forward that property tax bylaw on the 9th. But
and my expectation, coming into the meeting, my expectation was we would complete the work today, but it's good to know that there's that option. So if you could back up to the hotels, move forward. Yeah. So that's the part of our business community I think I'm most concerned about at this time, and I expect council is as well. And we're certainly recognize that there was a significant increase to some of the properties in their assessment for various reasons, and it is based on revenues. The odds are that given the revenues in that sector particularly are going to be, let's say, bleak this year, is it reasonable to assume that the assessment that's issued in 2021 based on July of 2020 this year, the assessments next year will be significantly lower? Is that a reasonable assumption?
You know, I don't want to speculate. That would more be the purview of the of our contracted assessor, but that would be my expectation, is that to the extent that the current pandemic situation has impacts to the income levels, then that would be captured really in this year's assessment and next year's taxes,
Right.
But wouldn't be reflected this year. It's kind of that delay based on how the process works.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that we don't have an option to use previous year's assessment values, we're obliged to apply the tax, the mill rate to the current assessment.
Correct. There is a significant amount of legislation at the provincial level around assessment and taxation, and we have, to my knowledge, no flexibility there really.
Right. That was my understanding.
Ms. DeSoto had a point, Mayor Borman.
Yes?
Sorry, just to compliment Ms. Richardson's point, I do believe that when the assessor looks at the revenue model for assessing commercial properties, that they look at 3 years worth of data. So while this year will have an impact, it won't be solely based on.
Right. Thank you for that. That's a good point and helps in my thinking about it. The other slide I had a question about was the reference to the likely increase of 10% in taxes in 2021. What was that slide? Future impacts. Right. If taxes are reduced to the 2019 level, which we're proposing, then council going into the budget for 2021 to follow with the trend, with the direction that we had been on at the beginning of this year, we would have to be considering a 10% increase from 2020, which we anticipate being reduced by 1.2. But that 10% increase would be if council indicated the intent to move forward with all of the various projects and expenses that have been on the table at this point. Arguably, at the end of this year, when council is working on the 2021 budget, council could again set an arbitrary tax increase and say, well, we don't want to see it more than a 5% tax increase or whatever. It's arbitrary perhaps in that context, but it's not an automatic 10% increase. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, that's correct, Mayor Borman. If you'll recall, when we approved this 2-year budget for 2019 and 2020, we also had a plan approved for 21 and 22. And really what we're trying to illustrate here is that decisions made to this current year budget will have an impact moving forward. We're not suggesting that there will be no changes to the budget moving forward. We just aren't yet in a position to be able to speak to what that's going to look like, but really are just trying to illustrate changes made this year will impact us in the future.
And I appreciate that. And the changes will either be in a bigger increase in tax requirement or reduced delivery of service.
Yes, I did read an article yesterday for the City of Toronto. They're looking at, in this same type of a scenario, a 45% increase in taxes or a 50% reduction in transit service. So again, these items are affecting municipalities across the country, many to a larger extent than us, but it is just a point we wanted to make sure council was aware of.
Yeah, I've been reading some frightening stories about some of the decisions that other councils, particularly in the bigger centers, it seems, are having to make.
Yeah.
Are there questions?
Ms. DeSoto has a comment. Sorry, Mayor Borman, I'm not sure if you can see her on your screen.
Well, I can see her, but go ahead.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out, because I don't want it to be underemphasized, the amount of work we did to remove $2.7 million of expenditures out of this year's budget in order to offset lost revenues. So a starting point would be that those expenditures come back in for 2021. And certainly, as Mayor Borman, you just rightly pointed out, we could review all of those expenditures again, but to continue with those deep level of cuts to all those service areas that Rogers had highlighted as a starting point for 2021 would be like turning the clock back in time for the town of Canmore. So we're focusing now on the capital budget items in order to reduce our contributions to reserves. But it's really important that we don't underestimate how much our services have been impacted by that 2.7 million reduction in expenditures that we already pulled out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. And I don't mean to make light of that at all. I know that budget discussions at the end of this year are going to be far more difficult than any I've been involved with since first being elected. It's not going to be an easy discussion moving forward. So I'm not dismissing anything you're saying at all. Are there questions from council then at this point for any of the materials presented so far? I mean, yes, there are. I know there's questions. Okay, Councillor Sanford, there you go. Yes.
Thank you for your presentations and information on the capital side. I did have a question just about the, if you wanted to go back to the slide that talks about the other projects for consideration. Yes, so there are 3 projects. There are 7133, 7134, and 7135. Those are all solar installation projects. Is there any benefit to doing those projects all at the same time? Is there an economy of scale? Is there something that requires them to be all connected? Or if we took out one, would it make a big difference?
We'll ask Ms. Smithers to respond to that.
So I don't believe taking one of them out would make a big difference. One of the challenges we have with those solar projects, which is why we flag them, is on the staffing side, with lack of availability of project management coordinators or just project managers. They are some projects that we might need to push off till 2021 regardless. So we added them to this list because there's some fluidity there with the timing of when we could take them on, but certainly we could look at removing one and keeping the other 2.
So essentially, I know that we've laid off a lot of facility staff. So these projects would be more difficult to deliver with our.
Yeah, and to be clear, the issue we're having there on the staffing side isn't because of the layoffs. It has to do with just mat leaves and timing of staff being available. So the current project manager in facilities is on mat leave and comes back in the fall. And then we have the fire hall going on at the same time. So it's really just a resourcing issue that we would have had regardless of the pandemic.
So this is more of a project management scope of issue versus a facilities staffing issue. Is that what I understand?
Yeah.
Oh.
If I
Okay,
could,
so
that point, there's Councillor Sanford, sorry, is that we do have a hiring freeze on. So in the past, we would have backfilled that mat leave with a staff member who might be able to, or a contracted person to deliver that project, but we have not backfilled that position. So that there is a COVID relation to that project not being resourced.
Okay. Can I also ask a question about the 7131 Rocktopia wall replacement? Do we have staff in a position to manage that project at this point?
Yes, we do.
Okay, so that's more feasible to do currently with our staff complement than the solar panel installations.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to explore that a little bit more. So if any of the solar projects are removed this time by council, then it would have to be approved in the future year to move forward with?
Correct.
Correct. And if those projects remain in the approved capital budget, what realistically would we expect to see happen over the end of this year and into early 2021?
There's a risk that we would not be able to take them on until 2021 because of the shortage in project management staff.
But if they stay in the budget, then
They'd be.
there's I don't want to overstate it, but if council was determined to see those projects move forward, and we left them in the budget, there is reason to believe that they could move forward by the end of the year. Or is that impossible?
There's a possibility, yes, the intent would be to take them on in 2020, but the risk is, just given the staffing shortages, that we would not be able to get to them until 2021, but they would remain approved projects.
Okay, thank you. Other questions, Councillor Hillstead?
Thank you, Mayor Borman. With the roundhouse solar in particular, I know that the roof needs
You're a little
repair.
quiet. Can you speak up a bit or something?
Yeah, worse comes to worse, I'll change my headset. With the roundhouse roof in particular, is the the roof in good enough condition to put solar on it right now? Because I know that there were some issues with the roof. Have those been addressed yet?
The roof does require some repairs to accommodate that. Well, not just to accommodate the solar, but the roof does require some repair, and that is scheduled to take place this year. I think in an upcoming council agenda, there's an update on that in the service area report. I just read that yesterday.
Because that would be my only concern, is as that's an outstanding issue with the roof. Generally, you want the roof good before you put the solars on. So if we had to remove one, that would be the one I'd be looking at, just because I know there's other issues that would also compound it, making it more difficult to install.
Yeah, and those roof repairs would be taking place regardless, and they are going to happen this year.
Yeah.
Councillor Mara?
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I was just asking a question about item 7028, the Bow Valley Trail and TP Town Transportation plan. Now, similar to project 7076, would it not also, from the planning, line up projects that we don't have funding for? Does that make sense, my question? Would it?
Yes, I understand your question, and I would agree that potentially the planning would identify future projects that we would have to find funding for. There, in the capital plan, I believe there are some road works scheduled for the TP Town area. Scheduling for road improvements in TP Town has always been hampered by wishing to wait till further redevelopment occurred. I'm not sure if Ms. Smithers has more to add, but I believe this planning was looking at what could be done in advance or ahead of any kind of utility work upgrade. So maybe on the cross streets for example.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Councillor Mara?
Councillor
Did
Mara.
you mean McCallum?
Yeah, I did mean Councillor McCallum.
No, it's my blonde hair must be very distracting. Streaming down my back. Thank you, Mayor Barman. And thank you, administration, for your presentation. I was wondering if you could give me some information on the coexistence near wildlife initiative. So you're looking at a $30,000 savings. What would we be deferring or cutting from that project?
So for the $30,000 there, 20,000 of that is removing funds for the social norms campaign that was planned. That was a campaign that the town of Banff was also participating in. They've also removed the money from their budget, so it's just consistency there. And 10,000 of that is the private tree removal program. So while we would still be encouraging removal of fruit trees and removal of fruit, the tree removal program itself, we would.
So would we likely do that social norms campaign without the town of Banff?
We would not be, I am not sure. I would defer to Ms. DeSoto on that. If the money was left in, would we be taking it on ourselves?
I think we would still do some work there if the budget remained. The idea, of course, is to work regionally on some of these initiatives, and that was the objective of the roundtable on human wildlife coexistence. But it doesn't mean we couldn't work unilaterally. We just wouldn't have as much impact without our regional partners.
Okay. All right, thank you very much.
Councillor Sandberg, did you have your hand up? Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. The 1-ton rock truck replacement 7141, the funding source from that, if I'm looking at the project summary sheet, is MSI funding. So I'm just wondering how that will affect putting that capital project back into the changing the reserve transfer from that. How would MSI funding actually affect, not spending MSI funding, how does that affect taxes?
I'm going to ask Ms. Richardson to respond to this because some of these funding scenarios, it's a bit like Tetris. So if we get the MSI funds back, we can use them to allocate to a different project that's funded by reserves, but I'm not sure if you want to add anything, Ms. Richardson?
No, so I mean, the advantage we have with MSI is, you've probably heard us use the word before, fungible. We have any number of projects we can use it towards. There aren't really too many restrictions in place on that. So the flexibility that gives us is, I don't want to say it's arbitrary, there is logic behind it, but behind the scenes, we can use MSI for any number of projects. And so by canceling one of these projects that currently includes MSI funding, we would just allocate that money towards a different program. So if we were to cancel that project this year, that reserve draw wouldn't happen. Our ending balance at the end of this year in the MSI reserve would be slightly higher. We kind of have disconnected the two. You'll see in the motions that we are independent of how any of these individual program or projects rather are funded. It works out well that the general capital reserve contributions, the discretionary ones in our operating budget, by taking out the 500,000 and the 700,000, it ends up being quite close to the 1.2 that we're looking for. And so what that means is we're taking out those, the MSI balance would be a little bit higher. But again, we could just use that in the future. We always have projects that we can use that funding for. Does that kind of help? Sorry, that was kind of a convoluted.
Yeah, I just wasn't sure how that would actually offset the amount of funding that we're looking for, because it's from a grant or from a reserve that's replenished with a grant. So we could actually use that to offset the increase that we're talking about. That's the only thing that I'm wondering. It's less money in that MSI funding for the future. If we use it now, if we spend it now, there's less money in the MSI reserve. But if we don't spend it and return it to that, what we're trying to do with reducing the taxes from 4.8%. That's the part I'm not really understanding. But if you're telling me that by being there, it'll change our future, then maybe I understand that part.
Maybe I'll try it another way. So the reserve transfers that we do from our operating budget, that's how we're choosing to impact taxes. And you might have seen some communities have canceled projects independently of reductions to their reserve transfers. We could look at those two pieces in isolation, but we've chosen to kind of connect the two to show that we make those reserve contributions in order to fund our capital program. And so to cut the reserve contributions without also canceling projects, we're shortchanging ourselves for the future. Fundamentally, by reducing those reserve transfers, we can no longer afford the capital program we were intending. So we could cancel projects from this list, and that was actually initially my thought, and then exactly reduce the reserve contributions based on how those projects are funded. But I don't think we need that level of complication. We can just reduce the reserve transfers that we do from our operating budget to our general capital reserve and our asset management, the rehab and replacement reserve. to the same total as this without looking at all those individual fundings. So what that means is if we were to cancel this project, our MSI balance would be slightly higher at the end of the year, and we would have a slightly lower balance in the general capital or asset management reserve than we otherwise would have. But overall, our reserve balances would be the same because we have that complete flexibility with the with this capital funding, especially with MSI. It's not a project specific grant like we have in some cases. Nothing with a restricted grant is on this list.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Can I just ask a question about MSI? So do I understand that the province has indicated the 2020 or the MSI funding, grant funding that were expected for 2020 won't come until 2021?
Correct, in our case. So what's happening is I think the province is managing their cash flows just as we're trying to do. And so historically, I don't think there's a huge amount of consistency, but we generally receive our 2020 allocation within 2020. But what's happened now is because we have a reserve balance for our MSI funding that we're still using that money that we've carried forward from previous years, they're now reaching out to determine your needs, I believe on a monthly basis, and distributing funds as municipalities need them rather than receiving your full allocation. So in this case, as we still have projects that are continuing from previous years that had associated MSI money, we're still kind of using up previous carried forward money. So in our forecasting, we're not anticipating to actually receive any of our 2020 money until 2021. It's just the timing has changed, but we're still expecting to receive the full budgeted amount, just the timing has changed.
So we're depending on the fungibility of money.
Correct.
Project that's going to happen sourced from MSI grants, we can fund now through our existing financial capacity, knowing that the MSI grant will come next year to replenish wherever that funding came from. So in that context, money's fungible. Just on that specific project, and I guess this is for Ms. Smithers, that project 7141, a big chunk of it is for the replacement of Unit 40, Unit 17, I should say, which is almost 20-year-old vehicle. And in my mind, this really comes down to affecting service levels. Am I wrong in thinking that? I mean, I'm not sure what that vehicle, well, how much of the budget, project number 7141 is in regards to that specific vehicle, and how critical to the operations of Public Works is that vehicle?
So the vehicle is important to the operation of Public Works. As Ms. DeSoto and Ms. Rogers have both said, we are a lean organization, and that means there's not a lot that we do that's not critical. I would say for the 1-ton truck, what we've heard from our fleet staff is, having taken a good look at it, we believe we could defer the purchase till 2021. So what we would need to do is come back, and you would see it as part of our budget recommendation for 2021, but we could put it off. The planned purchase was for 2020, so we could forego it this year, and then we would need to come back with it in our budget for 2021.
Great. So personally, I'm less concerned by the thought of keeping the 1-ton truck, which is 12 years old, going for another year. But in reading the project list or the project sheet, and noting what this project would allow for in future service delivery, with the new vehicle will be hook lift style, allowing for more versatility. So I guess what I'm hearing is that is one project that could be postponed for a year and not have a really significant impact on service delivery. Is that what you're saying?
Correct, yeah. We would not need it this year, but we would be asking for it next year.
And if it were to come back next year in that scenario, that $350,000 would represent what, about 1.5% tax increase? Is that somewhere in there?
Who's nodding her head, yes.
So by removing it at this point, it might add to the challenge for council in considering the next budget where this project comes back in.
Correct. So I would compare it to in the previous page on the summary sheet, the program 7140, the light vehicle replacement. That's where we've heard back from Fleet that we could look at repurposing other vehicles to cancel that program, right? But in this instance, with the 1-ton truck, it would be more of a deferral. We would, if council chooses to cancel it, council chooses to cancel for 2020, we would be bringing it back as a recommendation in 2021.
Thank you. Are there other questions from members of council about any of the projects that are noted in the list and the report, or any other projects that the councillors have questions about that aren't mentioned in the list? Councillor Sanford.
I'm just wondering if we are going to be getting to attachment 1 and 2. Is that something we're going to discuss later? Because there's a couple of things on attachment 1 and 2 that I had questions about.
Sure, we can take your questions. We weren't planning on reviewing those attachments as part of the presentation.
Okay, that was just for our information. On attachment 1, there's a line item that says rental and lease, and it's about 2/3 of the way down. So the annual budget for that was $152,920, and then there's a proposed addition to that, to increasing that budget of $4,986, and it says increased rental of porta potties for parks, net of savings across the organization. So how does that relate to our conversation about providing washrooms in the parks?
I
Who's
think
going to take that question?
Ms. Smithers can speak to that. That is about some rental of some porta potties that we've had to put in place. I don't want to misspeak though, Ms. Smithers, I think. I'll ask you, sorry.
Sorry about that. Yes, so that porta potty, I believe that is being referenced there, is the one that we've had to install at the skate park because the rec center is closed, and the parks staff had realized that there were some issues with that, so they had rented a porta potty to compensate for the closure of the rec center. I believe that's what that's for.
So that particular porta potty is replacing the washroom that's not available currently because the rec center is closed. Is that
Yeah.
correct? Okay.
Yeah, and there is a cost associated with that. Again, coming back to the COVID premium, there's a cost associated with that that we had not budgeted for.
Mm-hmm. And in the context of providing washrooms in parks, is that a possibility in the other parks where you mentioned the cost of cleaning the current washrooms is quite prohibitive to the standard that needs to be done for COVID?
It's sure, it's a possibility, but again, there's a cost associated with that that we've not budgeted for. And the other challenge that we would likely be coming up against, and we've seen this in some other areas, is we're not the only entity that would be looking for some of those workarounds. So the availability of some of the things that we might be looking to rent, in this case, porta potties might be an issue. I'm not sure. I'd have to check with our facilities team. But importantly, there's a cost associated with that. And then we'd have to look at the trade-off of the rental versus the increased cost that we'd have to pay anyways to open our facilities and clean them ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's two questions going on here, isn't there? The one of which is renting porta potties for certain locations and managing them. The other part of the same conversation is whether or not we should just reopen our existing washrooms and pay to service them. Am I right?
Correct, yeah. There's a number of permutations or options that we could look at. I think the important thing to note in this conversation is they all come with cost implications that, and we don't have that money in our budget.
Right, but if council was to, was interested in having the washrooms at our parks reopened, we would have to find $170,000 in the budget to do that, correct?
If the intent was to open the full complement of public washrooms that the town typically maintains at the COVID standard, yes.
Right. Great. That was my understanding from your earlier presentation.
I was just curious about the increase in budget there, and you explained it, that it was for an additional washroom in a new location. Thank you.
Councillor McCallum, you have a question?
Yes, Mayor Barman, thank you. So just back to the question that Councillor Sanford brought up. So $170,000, how many vaults do we own that is cleaning? Vault
Let's go
toilets, I
back
mean,
to
sorry.
my spreadsheet. So that is for, we have 7 vault washrooms. Currently, one of them out by the Three Sisters Dry Pond is not open. The rest of them are. The vault washrooms are, I would say, somewhat challenging for parks to maintain with in the pandemic, partly because they can only have one operator per truck. So there's logistical issues there. There's PPE that they require because of in cleaning the vault toilets, they use a pressure washer. So
yeah, the aerosol that you can't have
spray,
the splashback, so they have to be fully.
Yeah, so the PPE that's required is more than would be required for the facility toilets, for example, just because the method of cleaning them is different. As well, it takes more time to put that PPE on and take it off, right? So that takes a considerable amount of time away from other things that parks could be doing. So anyways, so there are 6 vault toilets currently open and 1 closed, and there is 1 serviced washroom open, that would be the downtown washroom, and 5 of them closed. And the 1 porta potty at the skate park.
So
I guess my concern about this is that if we don't open these toilets in, if playgrounds and recreation, and I'm not debating here, I'm just expressing my concern. If playgrounds and recreation facilities aren't going to open over the summer, and camp is on hold, we don't know what the future of camp looks like, but at this point, it's probably not going to happen. Like where people are going to be out and about in the community, I'm wondering if $170,000 is what we're going to have to pay to pick up people's remains in the bush. And that, well, I don't know, the bush is open, as my daughter likes to put it, the toilets are closed. And so I'm really concerned about that from a public health perspective.
Yeah, I'm just going to interrupt there, Councillor, because it sort of
I'm sorry.
into
I'm just trying to express I guess I'm trying to look to see like what's the cost benefit analysis here if we're going to decide to close the toilets. And it is expensive. You're absolutely right. And it is onerous and a lot of work for them to clean them. But I'm just wondering what the opposite, what the result of that's going to be and what that kind of cost is going to be.
So, and that'll be a good part of the debate. Are there other questions at this time?
Mayor Borman, I think Councillor Hillstad had his hand up. I'm not sure if you can see him.
Thank you, Councillor Hillstad.
Thank you. Are there any of under the other projects for consideration, are any of them, is there a possibility of grant funding for any of them? From other levels of government?
We have put some of those projects forward. Sorry, I'm just going to find that slide for us. The solar projects we have put forward on a list that's called shovel-ready projects. So both the province and the federal government had indicated that there may be some funding to help restart the economy. So those 3 projects are on that list. I believe that's it. Ms. DeSoto or Ms. Smithers, if you can comment.
I'm sorry, you said that was the solar projects?
Correct.
So with that, then, would there be an option to potentially cancel it from our reserves, but then have it, because I know we've done this in the past with some projects where a project will only go forward if grant funding is available. So is there a potential to choose one of those ones, cancel it for the time being, but have a placeholder in there that if grant funding becomes available, then it can go ahead. So you don't necessarily lose it, but we remove it for the time being. And then if something comes up, we can still go ahead and do it.
That is an option, yes.
I would just say, if council was interested in that option, there's usually a requirement for the municipality to contribute a portion of the funding. So we don't get 100% grants. I would recommend you keep a third of the grant of the project costing in the budget as funded and the rest of it unfunded pending grants, if that was a consideration.
Thank you.
Any other questions from council at this time? Councillor Sanford?
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I also had a question referring to on attachment 2. And this was funding that was returned from the budget for cost savings purposes for the flooring replacement for $66,000. It's about halfway down the column. Was that the flooring replacement for the Union Hall?
Anyone?
So I believe that was for the Stan Rogers stage, the Union Hall, and there were three projects with that. I think the Union Hall
Yeah,
was one of them.
There was some flooring replacement that had to do with the kitchen, and it was something about the flooring breaking down. I remember Councillor Comfort asking a question about that. I was just wondering if this was the flooring that we were talking about or something different.
Yeah, I will check and confirm that with you.
Mr. Irwin has just provided, it was flooring in the Scout Hall, the Union Hall, the Stan Rogers stage, and the Public Works admin building.
Oh, so 4 locations of flooring? Okay. Because what I understood was the flooring in the kitchen of the Union Hall was breaking down and it was a health hazard. And so I just want to make sure that something that might have been health related was certainly addressed.
That piece of the work was done, to my understanding.
I believe that one has already been completed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So there's no health concern on the flooring replacement because all the other projects are conditional
No,
on something.
on any of the projects that we have in here, we wouldn't be returning or canceling projects that would have public health or safety impacts.
Okay. I just want to make sure of that. Okay, thank you.
Other councillors with questions? Anyone? Going once. Councillor Hillstead.
The last time we had a situation even remotely similar to this was that 2008 with the where we had to claw back some amount of money from the budget that council did. And
yeah, it was an arbitrary $1 million asked of council for admin to find.
So how long did it take for that to get back to normal levels, essentially through taxes? Like, did we do it one year, or was it a number of years?
I can respond to that. It wasn't actually in 2008. It was a couple of years post 2008, so maybe 2010, because it took a while for the impact of the 2018 downturn or 2008 downturn to be seen. And yes, it did impact our operations for the last decade. In the last budget that we presented to council, we were still talking about how lean we were and some of the positions that we, in that situation, we actually offered early retirements and lost a number of positions through attrition, that it just, we were never able to get approval to put back into the budget. And there were other impacts as well to some service levels. I'm trying to think. None are exactly coming to mind. What's most prominent for me was the staffing cuts and the ability to get back to full complement of staff.
So I guess then, are we worried that that's going to happen all over again with this? If we do within looking for the 4.8% reduction, are we worried that going forward that could be the case again, where it takes another 10, 15 years to get back to normal?
Yes.
Whatever normal is.
Yeah, whatever normal is at that point.
Yes. And whatever normal is, it may be that we have to redefine our service level moving forward in order to respond to these cuts. Absolutely.
Thank you.
I had one or two questions just related to some of the report. And there was a brief discussion in the report around fare free transit and the expectation of how that will be managed. And it's, the report notes that the Transit Commission has indicated they have sufficient reserve balance to cover the deficit. I'm just curious if that question has gone to the Transit Board or yet to be determined whether, or is that a reserve that the town of Canmore actually controls? Anyone?
I can respond to that. That is a reserve that the Transit Commission controls, and they have indicated that they are able to fund that shortfall without approval from council.
Oh, without approval from their board, you mean?
Yes, sorry,
Right.
they can manage
Okay.
that within their.
Great. Well, I did have one other question, but I guess.
Mayor Borman, Councillor Sanford raised her hand. I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead, Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I had a question about the coexistence near wildlife initiative, 7143. That's one of the potential projects that could be removed. It's not currently recommended to be removed, but there was some recommendation or consideration that part of that project could be removed to increase some of our cost savings. And I'm noting that the social norms implementation is $20,000, and that was to be a project that was going to be co-sponsored with Banff or co-funded with Banff. But there's also the fruit tree removal plan that the town of Canmore was going to embark on, and the fruit tree incentive program on private property. Now, all of the funding in this project are for coexistence with wildlife, right? So if we actually funded the fruit tree removal plan, well, currently everything's funded because we haven't removed it. So if we wanted to amend that plan for spending that money, would we just bring it back as a motion later?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. So we don't really need to discuss that right now, because if we want to remove more funding, then we just talk about it later.
That would be for debate, yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, if there's any questions about the effect or impact, then now's the time to ask the questions.
Yeah.
But if it's purely a matter of finding consensus on council, then that's for the debate.
I guess my question was, this came up last when we were discussing further actions by the town for fruit tree removal that was on town property. And there was some concern that the town had to, in fact, review town land all around Canmore to determine if there were fruit trees. So there needs to be a plan implemented to go forward with that. But once the plan is done, then on an annual basis, we can go forward and remove those trees. So the plan has to be evaluated and articulated first, and then we can go remove the trees. Is that?
I think we have to inventory the trees that
Right.
are on town property, right?
So all on town property, but
Correct.
can't just go out and say, there's a fruit tree, we can remove it. We have to have an overall plan to do that.
That plan is still in the budget. What's being proposed to be removed is the incentive that we had put in place for private homeowners to remove fruit trees from their own property and to provide them with an incentive. So the planning portion is still in the project, but the incentive piece is what's being recommended. Ms. Smithers, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's
Yeah, I was just gonna jump in, so thank you for bringing that up. It's confusing because both programs had $10,000 of funding attributed to them, but the one on public, the one for fruit tree removal on town lands is not being recommended or not being put forward as an option. It is the one that was an incentive for removal of trees on private properties.
Right. Okay.
Take the funding from.
Okay. Yeah, because they were both $10,000. Okay.
Correct,
Thank
yeah,
you.
so I appreciate that it was confusing. Sorry about that.
But it wasn't being recommended to remove the dog park reallocation at Quarry Lake, the signage and boundary delineation.
That is still taking place.
Okay, so that wasn't recommended, but has that project already started?
It is underway, and I believe, once again, I just yesterday in the service area report for an upcoming council meeting read an update on that. I can't off the top of my head remember what it was, but I can provide you some information outside of the meeting with that if you want.
Okay, thank you.
Oops. We can remove that. There we go. Found my other small question. So it had to do with the financial impacts on top of page 7 of the printed report. And it's tabulating the reserve balance for the tax stabilization reserve. And it notes a redirection of safe park funds to COVID social programs. And I don't, so council did put that $110,000 that had been earmarked for that program that went back into the tax stabilization reserve?
Not yet. No, that's a recommendation as part of the next budget item, but we're just showing, because they're all interrelated, we're showing. So that is a recommendation. We've certainly been advising you that that's our recommendation, but you haven't done that yet.
Okay. So that's informing the detailed balance in the tax stabilization reserve, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, if council should choose not to redirect those funds, then the tax stabilization reserve would be $110,000 less than we're talking. That's the only impact.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay, great. Just wanted to clarify that. Thanks. 10:45. Are there other questions? Seeing none. We'll move into the motion and debate phase of this council or this agenda item then. And it'll be a little complicated. I'm certain. So there's in the report, there's 3 recommended motions. The first one is fairly straightforward. The second one I had provided last night by email a slightly differently worded motion for the second motion, which is specifies which projects would be removed from the budget. Now, at that point, when that motion's on the table, if any of those specific projects that are mentioned, council would prefer to keep in the funded projects, then I would look for an amendment to remove that specific project from the motion. And in the same way, if there's other projects that are listed in the bottom of the chart on page 5, other projects for consideration, if councilors wanted to include any of those in the primary motion, then that could be done through an amendment. So each project ultimately could be debated by council separately. So it'll take some time, I think, to work our way through all of that, but that's what we have to do. Just before we move forward, no, I'll save that. So with that, I will put on the table the first recommended motion that council approve the allocation of $300,000 from the tax stabilization reserve to the 2020 operating budget to cover incremental expenses incurred due to the COVID-19 pandemic. I look for discussion on that motion. I'll support the motion. It's clearly a necessity, and it was well detailed by administration what's informed that need. I have no hesitation in supporting that motion myself. Councillor Sanford, you had a comment?
If we were to increase the cleaning budget for the washrooms, would it be appropriate to amend this motion to increase it by that amount to come from that budget? Because we have heard that it is a significant budget increase to open our washrooms and clean them versus renting porta potties to replace our washrooms. This is a COVID-related expense. So if we increase this budget by $170,000, would we be able to have the standard of service in our parks for washroom cleaning?
You're interested in seeing that work done, that level of service applied on the washrooms, then and wanted to suggest that it be funded through tax stabilization reserve. That could be a separate motion, I suppose, or I think it could be an amendment to motion 1.
Because I'm assuming that the $300,000 that's being proposed here is for COVID-related increases in service. However, the washroom conversation wasn't part of that. So there are other places where that funding will be required, I'm assuming.
Correct.
So what's the ideal way to fund such a project that is considered, in my opinion, to be necessary? Because if our recreation facilities are all closed, the indoor recreation facilities are closed in the community, our outdoor recreation facilities are going to be more heavily used by the community, because that's where people have to go now.
Yeah. So of course, that's an operating expense, service delivery. So it wouldn't fit in with the motions around capital projects. I would be perfectly happy to have that as a separate motion rather than attached to this motion, which I think you're asking about. Would that work for you?
We're asking to add $300,000 from the tax stabilization reserve, but that apparently doesn't cover the increased operating costs of keeping our washrooms open.
Correct.
But it is an operating budget expense.
It's a different, yeah. the $300,000 is to address the costs that were itemized in the presentation by administration that were strictly COVID related. And this, the washrooms weren't part of that exploration.
But I don't see an itemized list of what's under the
It
$300,000.
was in the presentation.
It's a budget line.
On the chart on page 4, the 2020 COVID spending is noted at $300,000.
Right, but it's not itemized. So I'm not really sure what the $300,000 is being used for. However, I'm sure there are many places where that $300,000 will be used.
I had thought I'd seen detail of that in one of the reports. Maybe it's in a different report. Councillor McCallum?
Yeah, I believe that those itemized details were provided in previous presentations that we've had through Finance Committee, which is why it's sort of sitting at the top of our
Right.
minds, but we can't find it in the documents. I'm
Right.
wondering if we can, if it,
Comes to mind that
maybe we can pass the $300,000 motion and then move on to Councillor Sanford's motion with
That's-
regards to the toilets. Can we do
I
that?
would, yeah, the $300,000,
It's about opening downtown. It's about providing water.
yeah, it's not detailed. It's the,
Well, it was detailed. It's just not in this agenda.
but
I don't
it's
think.
yeah, more of a placeholder. So I think that's the best approach, Councillor Sanford, is to have council consider the first motion, and then I'm happy to have you put a motion on the table to the effect of that you're looking for.
Okay. I know that there were a number of items that would be funded with that $300,000. And we will be required to provide higher levels of service. So I will support the motion.
So is there any other discussion on the first motion to allocate $300,000 from tax stabilization reserve to the 2020 operating budget? For the discussion, Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I just got a message that this was on slide 10 of the presentation, the details of the 300,000. But regardless of that, I agree this is important to try to deal with the COVID-related expenses, as well as assist in opening our community up very slowly and ensuring their supports, public health supports around that reopening. The one thing that kind of scares me about this is that at some point, this $300,000 could be operationalized. So this could very well be part of our 2021 budget, including the idea of cleaning the higher level of cleanliness required for the washrooms. So, but I think it's important, and I think that it's probably a good roundabout dollar to start with in terms of trying to address these things from an administrative perspective. It's certainly going to be a moving target for administration, and to have them to have a little bit of financial freedom is the word, but flexibility to be able to address those changing needs is important. So I'll be supporting this part of the motion.
Yeah, and whether or not whatever actions take place, if this funding is approved, become entrenched in future service delivery or not, we know clearly, and it was certainly talked about in the presentation, that the situation we're considering right now, the medium-term scenario, is it's not going to cut it. So I'm fully prepared to have in the future have increased requests coming to council for funding from the tax stabilization reserve, such as this. I think this particular motion is to address the needs that have been experienced to this point already. So again, I'm quite prepared to support the motion. Certainly we'll expect to see a summary ultimately of how the funds are spent. And I know there'll be good dialogue between council and administration as we move forward. So council will be aware of how these funds are applied. Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. So moving into, or actually, did you want to put a motion on the table at that point, Councillor Sanford, regarding specific to the washrooms?
Yes, I would like to, based on what I've heard from Ms. Smithers, make a motion that the current parks washrooms that are currently closed, and I don't know if they have to be listed, because she did mention that a number of them are open, but I'm not really sure what's open right now, what's closed. But to provide parks washroom services with a budget of $170,000 for increased cleaning and sanitation.
And that'd be to be funded from the tax stabilization reserve?
From the tax stabilization reserve.
Okay. So to try to capture that, the motion is to reopen the public washrooms that are not yet reopened, and to be the cost of which would be funded from tax stabilization reserve. Capture your intent?
Yes, and do we have to have a budget amount of 170,000?
I suppose it would help to include that.
Yeah.
We could say up to $170,000 to be funded from the tax stabilization reserve.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly, again, I've said it before, I'll say it again, as we move through this, I fully expect admin to be back to council saying, this hasn't been adequate, or we're going to need more funding. But this, the $170,000 was identified by senior admin as their informed estimate of the cost of doing what you're suggesting.
Yes, and because these washrooms are also seasonal, it'll be a seasonal approach to having them open. However, I anticipate, even with the cancellation of a lot of the big public events, that a lot more public are going to be using these places because their choices are very limited in the community right now. As long as our indoor facilities remain closed, people are going to be looking for other places to recreate. So I think we should provide that service for them.
I don't know if Ms. Hyde has captured that motion and is able to put it on the overhead or not. It's looking like she is. Council amend the 2020 budget to reopen public washrooms with a budget of up to $170,000 transferred from the tax stabilization reserve. I think that captures your intent, Councillor Sanford.
Yes, thank you.
Did you want to speak more to your motion, or?
No, I think that's all I need to say.
Okay. I'll support the motion. I share the concerns that have been voiced by yourself and other councillors around the need to have public washroom spaces available. I certainly recognize the cost associated. I've watched several times our town staff cleaning the small vault washroom behind my place, and it's a big project. It takes them quite a long time, and they're doing that 2 or 3 or 4 times a day. Yeah, there is a big expense, but I agree that this is a service that the public really values, and we should be providing that service. So I'll support your motion. Further discussion, Councillor Seeley.
I'll also support the motion. I think opening public washrooms is something we need to do, and the higher level cleaning makes sense. In addition, there might be more washrooms we need to add as the downtown opens and everything else, and more cleaning is going to be required for those too. So hopefully it goes hand in hand with something like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's more washrooms to be opened downtown, but there's certainly an expectation or discussion around providing temporary washroom facilities downtown, which would.
That's what I'm alluding to, temporary, if that.
Yeah. Councillor O'Meara.
Sorry. I too will support this motion. I know that as we're being encouraged to go outside and spend more time outside, our residents, I think, will appreciate this because we are sharing it with people that are in from other communities. And I think this just adds another level of comfort or protection or safety for our residents to feel comfortable using them, knowing that they're going to be open and they can go out in recreate in the parks and feel safe. So I will support this motion.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I'll be happy to support this motion of Councillor Sanford's. Thank you for bringing it forward, Councillor Sanford. I do agree that as people are going out more and more in the community, they are going to do what they need to do. And just because we don't supply the place for them to do it doesn't mean that they're not going to do it. So this is a basic level of service in my mind, and that is what we committed to provide for our residents during this uncertain time. And this is an example of that. I know kids are, when they go out in the community during their day, are going further in the field. I know that my kid is definitely doing the rounds in town and stating to me that, oh, Mom, I needed to use the washroom. So if my kid's doing that, I'm sure everyone else is saying similar things. And now that the weather is nice and parents can bring their youngins out into the playgrounds, or not the playgrounds, in the parks, these washrooms are going to be even more important. So again, I appreciate Councillor Sanford for bringing this forward, and I'll be happy to support this motion.
Thank you. Is there further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. At this time, I'll call a 10-minute break before we start into the next motion, which might be a long discussion, a long debate. So it's, what time is it now? Call it 11. Let's say 11:15. Is that good for everybody? Okay, we'll see you at 11:15. Are we back live at this point?
Yes, we are.
So we're live. We're just waiting for counselors to come back into the room, the Zoom room. I expect there's hundreds of people watching this meeting because it's so important, but I'm told there's not
We got
that many.
13 right now.
13. There you go.
We were up to 18 there at one point.
Sarah, I haven't been welcome back and I can't get my video started.
Oh, darn. Oh, there you are. You hearing everything, Rob?
I'm hearing everything.
Okay, well, you just disappeared. Waiting for Councillor McCallum, Councillor Sanford. There's Councillor
YOLO.
McCallum. And there's Councillor Sanford. I'm just going to assume that we have administration in the room, just not visible.
Yep.
Okay, and I'll call the meeting back to order. So this next part of the meeting is where it's going to get complicated, I expect. Not a simple exercise. But just to set the stage again, remind council that where this started really was with direction from the Finance Committee for administration to do a lot of work and come back with a number of recommendations. One of which was the direction to reduce the tax requirement this year to the same level as last year, which effectively requires about 1.2 million in cost savings to reach that target. On the number of capital programs that administration has provided information and recommendations on, which in the printed report is on page 5. It's important to understand or to remember that the first 6 projects that are in the top part of the chart, which total $1,095,000, if all of those projects are approved to be amended or removed from the capital budget, the operating budget transfer. If all of those projects are approved, that will take us this close to our stated target. Arguably, council could choose to not remove any of the other projects that are detailed below the first 6 and recognize that we've, through administration's work, we are achieving a really significant cost saving in this difficult time without cutting too deep and hampering future operations. And certainly, I think we want to avoid being too aggressive in where we end up. It's been identified already that this it does take years to recover, if you will, from such a tax cut. And the example from 2010 or 2011, I guess it was 2010, was a good example. It did take several years for the town to compensate, if you will, for that $1 million reduction. And it did result in a much leaner organization, which is not a bad thing. We've shown that we're quite effective as the lean organization. So the process will be that I'll put the motion forward to reduce the project or to, I'll put the motion forward. I'll move the council cancel and amend the budget and scope of the capital project as follows. I don't know if Ms. Hyde has this to put on the, who's offline. See a note from Councillor Maris, somebody's offline.
Councillor Hillstead's having
Councillor
some
Hillstead.
problems. Yeah, he's trying to rejoin. He's just in the
Okay.
waiting room, but
I'll
it
just
must be a
pause for a
connection on his
second.
end.
I guess he just wasn't interested in listening to me ramble there. But we'll just pause for a moment while we get.
Well, can you blame him?
No.
Cheryl, can you just increase the size of that so that it can be read on screen? Thank you. Oh.
On.
Yeah, that works. Well, it works for me. That work for counselors? Okay, we'll just continue to wait for Councillor Hillstead. Councillor Mara? Councillor Mara? Unmute yourself.
Am I to understand that if we wanted to add another project for consideration, it would be another motion? Is that correct?
An amending motion. Yeah, I was waiting for Councillor Hillstead to be back to
Okay.
review the process because it's unusual or it's not our normal process.
I will wait.
Councillor Hillstead has emailed me. He's going to try to restart his computer. If not, he's going to join via phone. So it could be a couple more minutes.
Okay, well, my preference is to wait for him. So we'll just be patient.
You bet.
Who wants to tell a joke?
Not I.
Why did the kid throw his clock out the window?
I want to see time fly.
Ah, winning.
Really? I mean, that's about, I don't know, 100
Even I
years
knew
ago.
that.
Well, I'm trying to search for clean jokes, folks. Oh, that's rhymes.
I know that's outside of your
Why are
normal
fish so
spec-
smart?
Hmm?
Why are fish so smart?
Because they live in schools.
Ah, yes. Where do polar bears keep their money?
In the snowbank?
Yes. Okay, you're just too smart.
No kidding. I was like, what, like you feed him the answers?
Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Scold.
Scolds?
Scold.
Scold? Scold who?
Scold outside, let me in.
You know, this calls to mind Councillor Garreau.
Oh, yeah.
One of the greatest things about Councillor Garreau, and you'll all remember him,
He could skateboard.
he had such a horrible sense of humor that it was funny. His puns were, he was famous for his really bad puns. There's Councillor Hillstead. Thank goodness we can get back to the meeting. Councillor Hillstead, are y'all wired up? Not quite. Give me a thumbs up when you're. Give me a thumbs up or say something when you're. Oh, he's still connected. What are you saying, Councillor McCallum?
My daughter's thinking of running a joke booth in front of our house on Canada Day.
Okay, then.
Why not?
Councillor Hillstead, are you fully connected now? Not sure. Hello? Councillor Hillstead, if you can hear me, you want to wave or something? I guess you can't hear me. Or he chooses not to hear me. I don't
Looks
think
as
he's
though
moving.
yeah, I think he's frozen. So he might try to join with his phone.
And we have the technology to make that work.
Yep, he can join by phone.
Oh, he's moving again.
Moving again.
Oh. Oh, he's there.
There
You
we
there?
go.
You hear us?
I can now. My
Okay.
You keep cutting out. You're intermittent in your voice.
yeah, the computer's having issues.
Okay, well, we'll wade into this and hopefully your technology works.
I can always go to the phone if it doesn't.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll recap what I had said maybe before you disappeared or after, but so the process that will follow is I'll put the primary motion on the floor, which is on the overhead, and it's to reduce the amend the budget by reducing those 6 projects that are listed, and they're detailed in the staff report. And I wanted to be certain that councillors understand that those 6 projects in total will take us pretty much to our stated target of reducing the 2020 tax requirements to be the same as those in 2019. So we needed to achieve a total of up to 1.2 million, and these 6 projects bring us to, call it 1.1. Council could choose to leave it there and say that we've come close to our target and reduce the tax increase without cutting so deep that it has really long-lasting and very negative effects. Or council could choose to also amend the budget by reducing other projects that are either listed in the chart provided, or are there any other projects that councillors have considered on their own. And if we end up with significantly more than the reduction to 2019 tax requirements, well, it's not a bad thing. But I am very cautious about remembering the future impact of all and any cuts that we make at this time. So does everybody, and so once that motion's on the table, if there's one of those 6 projects that are listed that you would prefer not to have in the motion, then an amending motion could be debated, and one of those 6 projects or more could be removed from the motion. And then also councillors could move to amend this motion by adding other projects in from the list that are provided for consideration or others. Ms. Richardson will be running a spreadsheet that we could either follow in real time or look at from time to time to see the effect of the various motions. I believe Ms. Richardson is prepared and ready to do that. So the process is it clear for everybody? Do we all understand what we're doing here? So if anybody's not certain what's happening, let's have a question. Okay, so I can't remember if I put the motion on the table. I think I did, but the motion is that council cancel and amend the budget and scope of the capital projects as follows: by reducing project 7026 by 600,000, reducing project 7076 by 157,000, reducing project 1624 by 100,000, reducing project 7075 by 80,000, reducing project 7017 by 48,000, and reducing project 7140 by 110,000. And I'll speak in support of that motion. I'll be clear in acknowledging that the target we set was a target I had every confidence and continue to have every confidence that we can attain that target. And it may be that council prefers to stop with these changes and come very close to our stated target. When I look through the project sheets on these various projects, the first one, Complete Street Rehab Railway Avenue, is perhaps the one that I struggled more with than the others. But I think that hitting a pause button on that project wouldn't be a bad thing at this time. It allows engineering and the community to have a better sense of where the project that's currently in the ground is going, and for engineering to do some comprehensive planning and bring this next rehab project forward with more information perhaps. So that one I'm okay with reducing or removing at this time. The town center enhancement plan is disappointing because we've been kicking that can down the road for years. I remember back in 2011 even, there was an expectation when we were in the early stage planning for Arts Place, there was an expectation that the downtown town center enhancement plan would be approved some time ago now. But it's something that I'm prepared to push down the road again. The project 1624, the affordable housing, land and policies, most of that project, and that was a really important project, most of it's been completed. There's only a very small chunk of that, which if I recall was had to do with the Silvertip Wildlife Corridor study. Land use bylaw update in the same way. We've accomplished most of what we had intended with that project. Visitor accommodation review is another one that we've been pushing out, and that's disappointing that we may push it out again, but I'm accepting I can support that motion. And ditto with the light fleet replacement, I can accept that. So that's the motion. I'm speaking in support of the motion with those full 6 projects. And I look to members of council for discussion and debate. And so a hand going up, there you go, Councillor Mara.
Sorry. Is this one, I agree and I can support what's here, but I would like to add a project to this.
Yeah, so that would be an amendment.
Amendment. So I'd like to make an amendment.
Can we just hear the feedback on these 6 projects
Sure.
and then proceed with any additional?
Sure.
So I'm looking for a discussion on this primary motion. Further changes, further amendments would be to the primary motion, but right now looking for feedback on these 6 projects. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I agree with the rationale for most of them, but I would propose an amendment to take one off of this list and put one on from the other list. So I think we're going in the right direction, but I will propose an amendment when it's time.
And I'm happy if you start with an amendment to remove one of those projects, and let's keep that separate from the discussion on pulling in a different project.
Right. I would remove project 7140, the fleet replacement, mostly from the perspective of if we replace those vehicles now, we will actually be addressing some of our emissions concerns because older vehicles are not as fuel efficient and energy efficient as newer vehicles. And I would replace it with a project from below.
Is there discussion on that motion? Just trying to find the project sheet for 7140.
There are actually 3 vehicles that are being proposed to be replaced, and
Right.
they're all relatively old.
Yeah,
And-
so 9 and 10 years old.
Mhm.
9
And as we
11
know,
years old.
as vehicles are newer, their emissions tend to be more efficient. And so if this is an option right now for 3 vehicles for that amount of money, I think that is a good trade-off.
For discussion on that amending motion, Councillor Seeley.
I won't be able to support that. I think those vehicles, even though they are older, they can go for longer. They're making vehicles better these days. I think there's other ways we can look at this, so I won't support it. I think it's a good cut.
Yeah, in thinking about it, Councillor Sanford, I don't think I'll support your amending motion, although I appreciate your intent for sure. I'm also very concerned that through these cuts, we don't significantly or even marginally really affect our determination to put in place initiatives to meet our climate action goals. So you're perfectly right that there would be a marginal effect by replacing these vehicles. But when I look at the other projects for consideration, there's frankly very few within that trench that I'm keen to remove. So barring more of the debate, I think at this point I wouldn't support your amending motion. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. So question to Councillor Sanford via the chair. You're looking at swapping a project. Am I correct in my thinking, Councillor Sanford? You want to swap 7140 with another project, or?
Well, I think we'll proceed more slowly than that. So reduce or remove a project, and then it's up for another debate. What of the other projects in the second chart may come back in and may balance out the effect of,
right.
You know.
I guess I'm trying to understand which projects are competing, what Councillor Sanford is trying to, she's talking about taking a project out and then I'm guessing inserting another project in. So I'm just trying to understand which 2 projects are in competition.
Yeah, I don't know if Councillor Sanford, you want to talk to that. In my mind, we shouldn't be looking at it in that context of one competing against the other. It's what projects do we feel are important to continue with, and what projects do we not feel that way about, and then see where we end up.
Okay, well, I was just looking to understand the argument more based on, because it's clear that there's another project in mind.
Yeah.
So,
Well, Councillor Sanford, you're welcome to speak to that if you like, but it won't be part of the vote at this point.
Well, I was considering replacing that with the removal of either the solar project on the daycare or the 1-ton truck replacement, depending, because I thought I heard that the 1-ton truck replacement was something that could be pushed off into the future. And there are reduction in fleet expenses on the 1-ton truck replacement, but there's also an increase in annual costs of using that 1-ton truck. So,
you know, then this makes us start to debate different projects at the same time.
no,
I think we want to.
that was helpful information, and I get that you don't want to debate. I just wanted to understand where her thinking was at. That's all.
Sure.
So I appreciate that. Thank you, Councillor Sanford.
Yeah, I think we should weigh each project on its own merits and not in comparison to other projects. But Councillor Mara, you have a comment, discussion?
Yeah, I just wanted to express the fact that I could not support this motion. And the reason being, one, I think the vehicle can last a little longer. I know it would meet some of our climate action goals, but with reduced staffing, I think those will be maybe lighter in use. I don't know if I'm correct on that, but they won't be used as much. So for that reason, I can't support the motion.
So the discussion on the amending motion then to remove reference to project 7140. Further discussion? Seeing none, I'll call the question in support of the amending motion. Those in support? And those opposed? The amending motion is defeated with Councillor Sanford in support. So we're back to the primary motion with those 6 listed projects being canceled. Further discussion on that primary motion? Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. So I know that you took the time to go through project by project to share your feelings, and I won't do that because nobody wants to hear me talk forever.
Well, actually, the electors do, so
well, I will speak to some of them, and particularly two that are important to me. And one of them being the town center, and I'm sure to the rest of council, I'm not implying that. Firstly, we know that these are projects that aren't being canceled, they're being deferred. And so that hopefully that we will see them in next year's budget or in a subsequent budget. In particular, the town center enhancement plan is something that I feel that I have put my hand up in the air over and over for many years. And I just want to acknowledge that some work has been done, as we can see from the budget. So I'm glad to see that some work has been done. But I just want to acknowledge that, as you have, that this project has been pushed forward for many years, and always with something that's popped up in our community that might change the outcome of what the town center enhancement plan might look like. And I would say of all of the situations that have popped up over the years, this situation is the one that I think is going to have the most effect on the results of the town center enhancement plan in the future. So that project in particular, I can support its deferral to another budget, because I want to really make sure that when we do that project, that we do it right, specific to the situation that we find the world in right now in terms of public health. The other one I would like to speak to is the land use bylaw update. Also something that is near and dear to my heart. And although it's important that we do those updates, I do think it's something, again, with the public health world that we see ourselves in, might have consequences or changes within that review, or sorry, within the land use bylaw update that could have some effect and could be instantly irrelevant based on what the world looks like. So I just wanted to speak to those two in particular of all of them. They're all important projects. I totally agree with you. But sometimes we do have to compare to see which one has the greater benefit when we have limited dollars to work with. That being said, I am going to vote in favor of deferring all of these and reducing those project numbers as presented here in our agenda package. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, as you were speaking, Councillor, I was channeling or hearing Councillor Krausert, who was very eloquent in his arguments in support of like the visitor accommodation review. But at this time, even though I've been a strong supporter of doing that review, I agree with your comments and the points that were made in administration in their report. So is there further?
No, I was just going to say, I think in this case, deferring, it doesn't mean that we don't care about them. It's that it's a time of really, really tough choices. And
Yeah,
think in the end, that deferring these to when we know what the world is going to look like when it finally all settles out is important. And so then those
Yeah.
dollars will be spent efficiently. So yeah, I agree with you.
yeah, and it is noted, it has been noted that two of those projects, the land use bylaw update, the little that's remaining in that project and the visitor accommodation review, both of those conversations might better be had once we've moved through some of the other discussions, community discussions around the tourism task force and social license on tourism, and understand how perhaps our community may have changed in more than a temporary fashion after COVID. Councillor Seeley, you have comment?
I'll speak in support of this as well. I too am troubled by taking out town center enhancement. I think there was some really good synergy that went into that, and it seems to be a project that keeps getting pushed. But understanding what we're going through, I think delaying it makes sense. So I will support this.
Is there a further discussion on this primary motion? Just trying to remember where we were on the amendment, but that's been dealt with. If there's no further discussion, I will call the question. Those in support and opposed. Motion's carried unanimously.
Mayor Borman, do you mind if I interject? I'm just trying to follow the process as you had outlined it, because
Yeah.
you had indicated to Councillor Mara that you would be seeking an amendment to that list.
I
But would
did.
you like to proceed with a new motion now then?
Yeah, given we voted on that, we'll change the process a wee bit. And so any councillors that have an interest in discussing similar action on any of the projects noted in the chart below the 6 we just approved, now would be the time to put a motion forward to the same effect, that move the council cancel and amend the budget and scope of the capital project. Councillor Mara?
Thank you, Ms. DeSoto, for bringing that up. I would like to propose an amendment or a motion to also reduce or cancel for now or move forward the project 7028 until such time. I know it will come up again once the ARP is done, or for more future planning for the TP town area.
And you wanted to speak to that motion?
And the reason I'm bringing it forward is just, I know that this will create some future projects and need some funding. So I think this is something that can be moved until we know exactly what those are, or have a more input from the area.
And just out of curiosity, is your interest in having this specific project canceled in order to get council close, well, to our target of 1.2, or is it because you feel that project is
Both, one, to get us close, well, we would be at our 1.205, it would bring it to. But also I see that, I think, in my opinion, just to have more input, so that the planning, one, not put pressure on planning, and two, so we have more input from the community. Those are my two reasons.
Okay, thank you. And you know, when I was looking at reading the report and considering these things, so one thought I had about that specific project was the importance of, given that we are now, we have the TP Town ARP back before council for decision, and a lot of the discussion has been around putting more resources into planning and delivering in TP Town to improve the neighborhood. that's the only hesitation I have around that. And I'm not thinking that it's, I'm looking at the details. Yeah. It notes that some work will progress to allow planning for 2021. So again, I'll wait to hear further debate on the motion. Councillor McCallum, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was just looking for clarification from Councillor Mara. You said that you thought that it would be best deferred because then because of engagement? I'm not sure.
Not necessarily engagement, but when I know we had discussion about when putting in place different like roads, sidewalks, et cetera, and then them being ripped up and then having to be replaced. So I think it would be better for people to have an idea of what's going on first in that area before we move forward with any permanent plan for the area.
Okay, well, I think that is happening to a certain extent already, and some of that work has already happened. I'll wait to hear from my colleagues, but at this point, I could not support it. I think that we've set up, well, no, I'll wait to debate unless this is my time to debate.
So the project, she does describe the project as project scope includes engagement and conceptual design for Bow Valley Trail and TP Town. And I think you're right that some of that has occurred. Yeah, so the approved budget was 130, and so it indicates that 20,000 has been spent, which leaves 110 in that budget for savings. So in considering this motion, to be perfectly honest, this is a project that I could support reducing at this time, primarily to get us to the target, which I supported. Most, if not all, of the other projects for consideration are projects that I wouldn't support cutting at this time. So if this one is supported by council, that pretty much takes us to our target. So for that reason, I could support your amendment. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I could not. I think that it sends a really interesting message to the people of TP Town when we've gone through first reading of their ARP and yet we're cutting all funding or most of the funding for this year's investments in sort of planning out their community, a community that has been underinvested in by the town for quite a while now. I don't think that this planning work, I think I heard, and I've heard in past conversations, the concern that if we do this planning work, then there's going to be a request for funds, and we don't have any room in our capital budgets right now, so we shouldn't do the work. And I find that argument quite problematic, in as much as that we're telling the people of TP Town that you're important, we're revising your ARP, we're going to revise your regulation, so that developers can invest in your neighborhood, but the town isn't willing to invest in, at this time, in the basics of their neighborhood in terms of their base infrastructure. And if there's something that we've said is that we want to continue to service base infrastructure and essential services, and the roads and sidewalks of TP Town are base infrastructure, and we need to start planning to invest in those coming forward. Those investments in past have usually come from the streets and roads budget in terms of the rehab budgets, which is what I hope we will see in subsequent years. But I think cutting this project will send a really negative message to the folks in that neighborhood, and I'm not interested in sending that message.
good points made. I do note though that in the comments associated to that project on page 13 of the agenda, it notes that even with this reduction, some work will progress to allow planning for 2021 projects. So it leaves the funding to get the planning underway for projects that will presumably come forward in 2021. So it's not a complete abandonment. Councillor Seeley, you have...
Yeah, I won't be able to support this amendment either. I think TB Town has been underinvested, and this is an opportunity to give it a little bit of attention that it needs, and not a place that I'm comfortable in cutting.
Any other discussion on the motion? Seeing none. So on Councillor Mayor's motion to remove project 7028, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is defeated with myself and Councillor Mayor in support. So we're still at the short of the 1.2 million. I'll put a motion on the floor to remove project 7131, the Rocktopia wall replacement, which would be a savings of $95,000. And while I certainly can't speak as a user of that facility, I do know how popular, incredibly popular, the climbing gym is. So it's not like I dismiss the importance of that work, but it's just like the last project we described. There's benefits to a certain group of our community, and there's a cost as well. And so this is something that we have to weigh the pros and cons of. And as I suggested earlier, I'm personally trying to get to that 1.2 million number. And there's very few other projects under consideration in that chart that I would support reducing. So I'll put that on the table for debate, the removing of 7131, the Rocktopia wall replacement. Discussion on the motion. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I don't think I'll be able to support that motion. You know, the beauty of doing the Rocktopia wall replacement during this time is that the elevation place is closed. But when elevation place is open, that part of elevation place actually brings in quite a bit of revenue to the town. And the better experience that we can provide for people, the more revenue we're going to bring in, and we're going to really need that revenue. So this isn't necessarily a project that I think is reflective of the revenue that it could bring us when we finally are able to reopen that part of our community. And doing that work now would be the best time. And so I don't think I'll be able to support your amendment, your motion, sorry.
Further discussion on the motion, Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. I agree with Councillor McCallum. I don't think I can support this at this point in time. Mostly because it's an underutilized space. And I think when we do reopen Elevation Place, we're going to be looking at continuing with social and physical distancing. And if we have an underutilized space on the climbing wall where we can accommodate more people because we can spread them out more, I think it's a good direction to consider that we may be facing some COVID-related issues for quite a long time. So if we can develop that underutilized space and allow more people in the facility with more room between them, then I would think that this would be the time to do that. So I won't support that motion.
Fair enough. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Mayor Borman. I won't be able to support that either. For a lot of the reasons that I've heard. An elevation place is closed. It's going to need to be done at some point, and I do think it's a revenue generator. So I'd like to.
Great. I'll just remind council that we're going to have to make some, well, we don't have to make more cuts, but every cut we make is going to have a negative effect on some portions of our community or some of our facilities. So is there a further discussion on the motion that's on the table? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion defeated with myself and Councillor Mayor in support. I'll just interrupt this portion by asking a general question, I guess, for feedback is the general will of councillors to stop at this point and be supportive of where we're at with reduction of not quite 1.2, but close to? Or is there a real urge to find other savings? Because I'm perfectly prepared to stop at this point. Councillor McCallum, you have a point?
I have a motion that I'd like to put forward from the list and.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I would like to put forward 7135, which is the roundhouse solar system. It sounds very celestial when you say it that way. You know, I was thinking about what Councillor Hillstad had brought up in previous discussions and just sort of marrying that with what Ms. Whitney had to say about project management. And I'm wondering if maybe of the 3 solar projects, this is a good one to defer forward just for 1 year. We do have them on the shovel-ready list for the provincial government or the federal government if they have any stimulus funding to pass around. So that's great. But this project in particular, and the inability to, not inability, the bottleneck that we're seeing within project management right now, based on the staffing that we have available, I'm wondering if it's better to just sort of reduce the scope of the solar projects to 2 instead of 3, and then have the roundhouse deferred till next year. Part of that because it gives administration more time to manage the issues with the roof. And secondly, it takes one project off the plate of what limited project managers we have right now. And so that is, you know, I think the solar is really important, and I understand the savings that it's going to provide our community over time. And I still think it's important. I just wonder if for those reasons, if maybe that's the project that we might want to defer to a future year, next year.
So to that point, canceling the project isn't necessarily deferring it. It's canceling it. So presumably at the next budget discussion, it could be brought back in, but it's not sitting there in, you know, in the shadows. It's on people's minds. But just speaking to your amending or to your motion, I won't be able to support it. I won't be able to support any motions that impact on the work we're doing around climate action. I feel that is a really top priority, has to be for our community. I heard from the discussion with the administration that solar project on the roundhouse could proceed at the end of the year or early in the new year. But I also, I'm concerned that any project that's canceled, we might say that it can come back next year, but we don't know that. I mean, there'll be a difficult decision on the budget for next year, and it might be the council decides to kick that one off down the road again. And also we are, as we've heard, that project is on the list that we provided the province for shovel-ready funding. And if I understood the discussion with admin, we do have to have some approved funding on the project for it to be considered for that shovel-ready. But bottom line is I won't support any reduction of our work that will reduce the the effect that we're trying to have on our climate. So the solar projects, all three of them are locked in for me. Further
Your
discussion
sacred
on,
cows.
yeah. Councillors McCallum, Councillor Seeley to Councillor McCallum's motion.
Just a point of clarification. I thought when Councillor Hillstead brought it up, those were shovel ready, but they're also grant applicable. So I thought we could take a look at each one of those solar projects and put in a third of the amount. Is that not, will that impact us?
The shovel ready funding that the province is.
Well, they're also grant dependent, right, to move forward?
I don't recall what you were saying, Councillor Hillstead. The Roundhouse is funded through a MSI capital.
So from what I understand, those are currently just funded, but there's a chance between either the federal or the provincial government for grant funding. So my thought originally was, if we were going to look at those, was to make them dependent on getting grant funding. They aren't currently grant funded. It would be with grant funding, then they would go ahead. And then Ms. DeSoto said to keep at least a third in there, because generally with that type of grant funding, you need to fund it and they will cover a portion of it. So if we were going to go with that direction, then we'd have to keep a third in to then enable the project to go forward with that grant funding. Because it's not 100% grant funding, it's a portion of the municipality and then a portion from other levels of government. So currently they're just funded. They're not grant funded at all. It's just there's an option for them to be grant funded.
Well, the MSI is a grant, but I take
yes, but
we're looking for funding from a different program, but there's no certainty at all. I can only imagine how many millions of dollars of shovel-ready projects have been provided to the province from municipalities across the province, and there's no certainty that A, the town of Canmore projects will be funded, or B, all of our projects. So there is a risk involved in saying, well, we'll only move forward if we get a different grant funding for that project.
Thanks for the clarification.
Further discussion, Councillor Hillstead.
So I will support Councillor McCallum's motion, as I was going to propose something similar or the same, just because, again, due to the roofs needing to be repaired, due to the fact that it may not get done this year anyways, just regardless, as we are having staffing issues due to mat leave and not being able to backfill. So there's a chance that these projects will be in the budget, but they won't even be done this year. So they'd have to be whipped forward anyways at that point. So to me, it makes more sense to remove just one for now, because we're still getting probably Arts Place probably, I think from the report, uses the most energy. So we're still getting the ones that produce, that will get the best bang for our buck on, but that one then will, again, with the other issues that are involved, I think it's makes sense to remove that for the time being, as there's still no guarantee, even with it in there, that it's going to get done. So that's my rationale for supporting it.
And in the spirit of the debate, if we take it out, we're certain it won't get done. If it stays in, there's a possibility it'll get done. So taking it out is a final decision, and leaving it in with some uncertainty is, well, just that. It allows the project to proceed if the situation is supportive, which I continue to understand. The feasibility is to move forward with that project. Other discussion on Councillor McCallum's motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor and opposed? So motion's carried with myself and Councillor Seeley in opposition. So let's have a look at where we are at. Ms. Richardson, with the spreadsheet you're running in the background. if possible. Maybe nobody can hear us. Oh, there you are.
There we go. I was just putting in that change. So with the roundhouse solar system moved up, we are at 1.225. If you can see my screen there.
Great. So that would take us to our target that we established at the Finance Committee.
Correct. It would be a tax decrease of 0.1%.
0.1, there you go. So, and that's not the, the final, and that doesn't have to be it for council, but Councillor Sanford, you have another amendment?
Yes, I would like to propose another amendment to
It's actually a motion, sorry, not an amendment. It's just a new motion.
Motion 7143. There was discussion. I think what I heard about the dog park was that it's already underway. So it's not being considered as something to change at this point in time. However, the social norms, I think we could remove the social norms campaign funding, but also add back the tree removal funding. So what I would like to see is because we don't have that opportunity to work with BAMF on the social norms funding for the project. But what was also removed from that was the private property tree removal of $10,000. So essentially, I'd like to see the social norms removed, and then I will also move the next one. So social norms, $20,000.
And your argument is that because BAMF, the town of BAMF's not doing that, we shouldn't do it?
Well, we had a project that we were going to work on together. In fact, I thought we were piggybacking on their project. They
doesn't preclude us from doing our own project. It is important here.
Well, it is something that is recommended that we could remove. We were co-contributing to it. So they were contributing and we were contributing. And it was something we were going to work on together because they also have issues with that. But if they're not doing it and we're not doing it, then we're not collaborating on it anymore.
So there's $30,000 it's referenced, and 20 of that, as you say, is social norms campaign, and the other 10,000 is the private tree removal. And your motion is to amend that project by removing the social norms campaign, but leaving the rest as is.
Yes.
Did you capture that motion, Ms. Hyde?
Yes.
So
thank
only
you. I have it.
$20,000, not $30,000.
So there would be reduction by 20,000. I think I'm understanding your motion correctly, basically to remove $20,000 from that budget and not moving forward with the social norms campaign.
Correct.
I'll also speak against that motion. The work we're doing to manage human wildlife conflict is every bit as important to our community as well, I was going to say the climate action. It may be not quite the same, but that work is really important. And the social norms, I think, is a really key part of the work we're doing. Part of the issue is people tend to say we have to protect the wildlife, but they're not prepared to make any changes to their practice. They'll keep growing fruit trees or bushes or whatever, and then get unhappy when a bear comes along and is put down because of that. I've long felt that key to success in this human-wildlife coexistence work we're doing. A key is to get our community to actually support the intent and make some small sacrifices to meet the goals. So regardless of whether the town of Banff moves forward, that's not material to me. I mean, it may change how we move forward with the project, but the town of Banff is in a very different position when it comes to human wildlife management than we are. And I won't support your motion because I think it's really important we move forward with that very small piece of work.
And the fact that we were collaborating on it actually gave us more clout, gave us more opportunity to be impactful, but it's a lower amount of money. So without that collaboration, I just don't think we're going to get very much for that project.
I have no idea really what that collaboration would comprise. I mean, I don't have enough information to understand whether or not the project, I think with that funding in place, our staff can do quite a bit of work. Maybe that working with the town of Banff, we could do broader reaching work and talk to the whole Bow Valley rather than just residents of town of Canmore. But I don't think we should be making decisions based on whether or not the town of Banff is moving forward at the same time. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Mayor Barman. Thank you, Councillor Sanford. So I don't think I'll be able to support this motion. I can see where there might be some discouragement because that we're not able to collaborate with Banff on this, that it might not be worth doing. But I also realize that, in the collaboration piece, there's probably some money that would be saved as a result. However, we're a very different community, as you know, from Banff. Banff has Parks Canada, and they have wardens, and they have people out and about to help educate citizens as well as guests that we don't necessarily have. We know that our COs have been cut over the last 2 summers, and so therefore we have no CO protection in our wild spaces. And I think as recreation centers and parks, our playgrounds and so on and so forth are closed, as you've pointed out, Councillor Sanford, there's going to be more and more people out in the backcountry, out in our wild spaces. And so that being said, I believe that we need this social norms campaign to help us police some of that behavior or educate some of that behavior, and really help our locals walk the talk. If we say we care about wildlife, then we're going to do what needs to be done to take care of our wildlife. So I don't think as a result, I would be able to support that cut. We've reached the target that we were looking for, also in this exercise, and made some really tough, but I believe wise choices. And I'm happy to stop at this point overall with regards to cutting at this time.
Further discussion on Councillor Sanford's motion? So if I could just have that motion repeated, or Ms. Hyde, do you have it written? Okay, so motion 119-2020, moved by Councillor Sanford. The council amend the 2020 budget by canceling and amending the budget and scope of capital project 7143 by $20,000, the Social Norms Initiative. Thank you. So I'll call the question on that motion. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's defeated with Councillor Sanford in support. Are there other motions councillors like to bring forward this time? Seeing none. Okay, there's none. We'll move on then to the other recommended motion, which was the council reduce the 2020 contribution to the general municipal capital reserve and asset replacement and rehabilitation reserve by the amount equal to the reduction in capital spend just approved, and reduce the 2020 tax requirement accordingly. Is there a discussion on that motion? I think I'll easily support the motion. It's the summary of what we've just been doing for the last couple of hours, or 3.5 hours, I guess. Is there any discussion on that motion, Tal? Councillor McCallum?
Thank you, Mayor Barman. So I guess what I would like to say and remind the public is that, well, firstly, I wanted to thank administration for their work in bringing these forward. It was very thoughtful work. It was very precise. And in consultation with their departments, we're able to come up with the sort of 2 levels of triage in terms of options for us to choose from. I guess what I'd like to really remind people is that this is not an easy exercise for council or for admin. This was an approved budget that we approved in December of last year. And in January 1, administration takes that budget and they begin to march on in providing services as approved through the budget. And the budget is also meant to be sort of a reflection of our values as a community. So it's tough for me as a councillor to make cuts to projects that I know that are really important to members of our community because it reflects our community's values. At the same time, though, what I think is really tough about this is the fact that here we are in the end of May. We've already spent 5 months of our budget, and yet we're having to rescind on that in addition to the actual year itself. So it just proves how difficult the work is, and how nobody is taking this lackadaisically. And then although these are tough cuts, that I think that they are well thought out by myself and by my colleagues here. And so I will be approving item 3 in the motion, the third motion rather. But I just wanted to remind everyone out there in Zoom land or YouTube land that this is tough to do, and there's we're going to feel these cuts in our services as well overall based on the changes that we've made today.
Thanks very much, Councillor, and very well spoken, I must say. And in the flavor of what your comments, I'll also speak a little bit to the public about this. And I know that members of the community will be disappointed or upset that we haven't slashed the budget by 30% or whatever some communities are doing. I think our approach, the approach that we've taken at the town of Canmore is far better considered than some that I've read about in other communities, where we've been very careful about how we've reduced the approved budget. We've had a reasonable target of no increased tax requirement from 2019. I know by being somewhat involved with some of the conversations here at the Civic Center over the last couple of months, that this has been a ton of work for administration, and it's I have undying respect for the work that our administration is doing, generally speaking, and this work was really a serious challenge, and they've come forward with some very well considered recommendations that allows council to meet our target, our goals, and not cut so deep that there'll be really meaningful reduction of service and quality of life to the community. And I'm happy where we've ended up because I have been through periods of budgeting where we were trying to make up for, $1 million in reduction in that one budget year. And I'm not looking forward to having to approve a 10% increase to taxes in 2021. That's not something I want to be contemplating, but even with these moderate reductions, that may be where we are at. So I'm really happy with where we've ended up. I'm very comfortable with the direction we've given, and I think council is clearly doing the work we've been elected to do. And I'm happy to have further discussion from members of council to that effect or others. So there's no further discussion. Then I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I guess that makes a good break point for quick lunch. The next two items will not be short. I don't think we want to start on them right away. So it's 12:25. Is everybody comfortable with being back at 1:15 for the next agenda item? Councillor McCallum?
I'm sorry, Mayor Barman, I thought that this meeting was running until noon. To schedule till noon?
It may have been in our calendar, but I certainly didn't expect it to end at noon. Are you challenged with staying? Because
Yeah.
The option which was identified was to postpone the rest of the discussion to the June, whatever that next date was. June the 9th.
Oh, 9th.
Yeah, there is in the calendar a special meeting on the 9th. The downside is that won't allow either social FCSS, Ms. Brown's group, or economic development to get started on any of the work envisioned. Ms. DeSoto, do you have comment? No?
No, I was just going to reiterate what you just said, that was our hope, was to get those programs approved today. Unfortunately, if timing doesn't permit, that's up to council's discretion.
In fact, though, I'll just jump in and say those were the original only two items on this agenda. And we added the budget so that council could see the whole picture. But initially we called this special meeting just for those two items.
Yeah, I would just, I guess, add to that was that the part of the motion that said bring back the program, the entire budget picture for you as soon as reasonably possible, was because the Finance Committee had indicated they would like to see those programs proceed while the need is still really imperative. So yeah, I understand the constraints. I apologize for not having put a hold in council's calendar for longer. This discussion took longer than we anticipated.
How's the rest of council's time availability? Is there anybody else that's challenged, as is Councillor McCallum?
I'm available.
So Councillor McCallum, is there any chance you can re-plan your afternoon?
I guess I'll let you know when in 45 minutes if I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Then we will take a postponement and reassemble it 1:15. And in the meantime, I expect I'll have a conversation with Councillor McCallum, my guess is. When we reassemble, if there's 5 of us, then we'll have to make a decision whether we choose to proceed or not.
Is there any opportunity at all to, instead of waiting until the 9th, to hold another special meeting next week in addition to our regular council meeting, or is that not possible? The agenda doesn't have to change. It's the same agenda. It's just tabling. I don't know if that's a good solution or not. There's certainly a majority of council here that are able to vote, and I understand that. I don't want it to hold up the meeting just because of myself, but as the mayor points out, that this is going to be a sizable piece of work. And if this is going to be another 3 hours, I can't, I'm sorry.
So I would just respond to that if I may, Mayor Borelman. Councillor McCallum is quite right. These could be postponed to the June 2nd meeting or added to that agenda, which I believe is going out today. There would be no changes to those reports. The June 9th was specifically if we needed to take feedback from today on the budget items and bring you a new budget. That would have needed to wait till June 9th. But June 2nd would be a possibility to postpone the rest of the agenda.
Yeah.
I haven't looked at the agenda review for that. Is that a chock-a-block meeting already, or?
It has the 3 public hearings, and then CP Town ARP is back for second reading. 2 other items in the draft agenda. It's imagined that the meeting should be completed by noon. I guess part of that depends on how much participation there is from the public at 3 public hearings. Suppose if council prefers, we could postpone the rest of this agenda to the June 2nd. It is important in my mind that Councillor McCallum be involved in these discussions, given my respect for the opinion that Councillor McCallum always brings to these discussions, and also she has been quite instrumental in helping move these conversations forward. You know, I'm only hesitant because I wish we could have implemented some of this COVID-related work a month ago, and I'm not faulting administration in any way on that. It's just how it is. Councillor Mara, you had your hand up.
I was just going to say pretty much what you did, that Councillor McCallum, oh boy,
McCallum.
was pretty much the one who brought up what we're going to be discussing. So I think it's valid to have her part of the conversation, and I'm fine with June 2nd also. So whatever.
Everybody, great. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting. Is everybody's calendar clear for the afternoon of the 2nd? Councillor Seeley?
Yeah, these are 2 pretty big items. I'm wondering if we can tackle one more today, if Councillor McCallum does have the time. Because I worry about June 2nd being in the same position where it's a very full day, and I guess I just want to make sure we're comfortable getting through. Wondering if we can push one more of these items through today.
Yeah, I don't think there's any pushing on these. I think each one will take a big chunk of time, and given it's 12:30, if we push through now, my guess is it'll be an hour and a half on each item. I mean, it could be. I understand that Councillor McCallum's time is very limited, and I think everybody needs a break between this conversation we've just had and the next one. And I hear from the CAO that the other 2 items can wait to the 2nd, then I'm comfortable with that, and I'll put a postponing motion forward to that effect in a minute. That's what I'm hearing from the CAO, correct? Yes.
It's council's discretion if you want to proceed with the items or wait till June 2nd. They can be added till June 2nd is all I've said, yeah.
Okay, no, Councillor McCallum?
I was just going to say that I just looked at the day, like we're booked from 9 to 6 next Tuesday on the 2nd of June. So there's plenty of time in that day to tackle these particular items, even with public hearings and possible ARP amendments. So
okay, great.
I'm really flattered that everybody wants me here.
Don't know if I said that exactly. I did say that. So then I'll move that council postpone items H2 and H3 for presentation and discussion at the June 2nd meeting of council. Discussion on that motion. I think we've had the discussion. I'm disappointed that we can't move more quickly, but we are moving carefully, and it's better to make the right decisions, well-informed decisions a week from now rather than not having the full perspective from all of council on these important decisions today. And I suppose in thinking about it, I mean, there is a possibility that we could be 7 councillors next Tuesday. I'm not certain. That's a possibility. So motion to postpone is on the table. Discussion on that motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. I'll then move that this meeting be adjourned. Those in favor? Opposed? We're adjourned. See y'all out in the